Chapter 1, The Echo of a Name. The world, for the last 6 months, had been painted in muted colors, smelling of old paper and the sharp, clean scent of lemon polish. It was a gentle, quiet life, a stark contrast to the one she remembered. The before, as she called it, was a blur of digital noise, deadlines, and the constant hum of a world spinning just a little too fast. Here, at St. Jude's Orphanage for Girls, time moved at the pace of the sun creeping across the library's worn floorboards. She was curled in her favorite armchair, a magnificent, faded floral beast with arms worn smooth by generations of lonely children seeking solace in stories. In this world, her name was Ariana. Ariana Dumbledore. That name had been the first shock, a jolt so profound it nearly shattered the fragile calm she'd painstakingly built since waking up in this small, unfamiliar 11-year-old body. She hadn't woken with a scream, but with a sharp gasp, her mind a frantic storm of memories from 2 different lives. One belonged to a woman in her late 20s, an architect who loved rainy days and the bitter taste of dark coffee. The other was a collection of faded, watercolor impressions, a rough woolen blanket, the bland taste of thin broth, the kind, wrinkled face of the matron, Mrs. Gable. It took a week for the impossible truth to settle in: she had been transmigrated. The how and why were gaping, unanswerable questions she learned to tuck away in a neat little box in the corner of her mind. Panicking, she reasoned, was a waste of energy. Survival, adaptation, understanding, those were the only things that mattered. The name Ariana Dumbledore had come from Mrs. Gable, delivered with a sad, gentle smile. "Your parents chose a beautiful name for a beautiful girl," the matron had said, tucking a stray strand of honey blonde hair behind her ear. "They were a sweet couple, your mother and father. A bit distant, perhaps. Kept to themselves. Said they came from a very old, very private family. The Dumbledores." The architect, the woman from the before life, had been an avid reader. She devoured fantasy series like a starving woman at a feast, and the Harry Potter books had been a cornerstone of her childhood. The name Dumbledore wasn't just a curiosity, it was a blaring alarm in the dead of night. And Ariana Dumbledore, that wasn't just a name. It was a tragedy. A pivotal point in the history of one of the most powerful wizards of all time. That first day, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest, she had sought out a mirror. The face that stared back wasn't hers, not the familiar one with its tired eyes and the small scar on her chin. This face, it was ethereal. It was the face of a girl on the cusp of true beauty, with a delicate, heart-shaped jaw and skin like pale cream. Her hair was a cascade of light, honey blonde silk that fell to her waist. But it was the eyes that held the true power of the illusion. They were a startling, luminous shade of periwinkle blue, vast and deep, holding a wisdom no 11-year-old should possess. She knew, with a chilling certainty born from fan art and vague book descriptions, that this was the face of Albus Dumbledore's lost sister. The resemblance was uncanny, an echo from a century ago. The matron had explained her lineage simply. Her father was a Dumbledore, yes, but from a line that had lost its spark, as he had put it. A squib. He had married a Muggle woman, and for a few blissful years, they had lived a quiet life. Their deaths, a mundane car accident, had left their only daughter, Ariana, an orphan. This explained her presence here, away from the notice of the main, magical branch of the family. She was a footnote, a genealogical anomaly. And crucially, she was not the original Ariana. There was no trauma etched into the marrow of this body, no seething, uncontrollable mass of suppressed magic. She was not an Obscurial. The thought was a profound relief, unclenching a fist of fear around her heart she hadn't known was there. The tormented soul of the first Ariana was at rest. She was just a girl who had inherited her name and her face, a vessel for a new soul. A quiet confidence began to bloom in the ashes of her initial fear. She was not a victim of circumstance, she was a player, albeit an unexpected one, in a game she knew the rules to. She had knowledge, foresight that could be both a shield and a sword. And she had something else, something the books had never truly captured. Magic. She could feel it. It wasn't a thought or an idea, it was a physical sensation, as real as the warmth of the sun on her skin or the solid weight of the book in her lap. It was a constant, low hum in her blood, a second pulse that beat in time with her heart. It thrummed at the base of her skull, coiled in the pit of her stomach, and pooled in the palms of her hands. It was a living, breathing part of her. In the quiet solitude of the orphanage, she had begun to experiment. She didn't need a wand for now, the very notion felt foreign, like needing a wrench to turn a key. She could weave the magic. Sitting in the garden, she would give a wilting rose a gentle nudge of her will, and its petals would perk up, regaining a fraction of their lost color. She could summon a soft, warm breeze to dry the laundry on the line a little faster. When young Chloe, a perpetually sniffling 6-year-old, scraped her knee, she would rest her hand over the wound while distracting Chloe with a story, feeling the magic flow from her palm, a soothing, tingling warmth that knitted the skin together faster than it should, leaving only a faint pink line by the next day. She never did anything flashy, never anything that would draw attention. They were small, subtle acts of will, as natural to her as breathing. It felt right. She was a calm sea, and the magic was the deep, powerful current that moved beneath the surface. Her confidence wasn't arrogance, it was the quiet certainty of someone who knew, intimately, the full scope of her own being. "Ariana, dear." The voice, soft and familiar, pulled her from her thoughts. Mrs. Gable, the matron, stood at the entrance to the library, a kind smile on her face. She was a stout woman with grey-streaked hair in a sensible bun, her apron always smelling faintly of baked bread. "Lost in your books again," the matron chuckled. "It's nearly time for tea. Come along, you'll miss the good biscuits." Ariana closed her book, marking her page with a practiced, gentle motion. She slid out of the armchair, her movements fluid and graceful. "Of course, Mrs. Gable. I wouldn't want to miss your biscuits." Her voice was soft, melodic, yet held a note of composure that often made the other adults at the orphanage treat her more like a peer than a child. They saw a polite, reserved, and unusually mature girl. They didn't see the calm, knowing soul behind the periwinkle eyes. In the dining hall, the familiar, comforting chaos of 20-odd girls reigned. The clatter of cutlery, the chatter and laughter, the occasional squabble over the last jam tart, it was the soundtrack of her new life. Ariana took her usual seat at the end of a long wooden table, beside a shy 9-year-old named Mary who was her closest thing to a friend. "Did you finish your sums, Ari?" Mary whispered, pushing a biscuit towards her. Ariana accepted it with a small smile. "I did. I can help you with the long division after tea, if you like." "Oh, would you? You make it seem so easy." It was easy. Mathematics, history, literature. The curriculum of the small school attached to the orphanage was laughably simple for a mind that had completed a master's degree in architecture. She had to consciously hold herself back, to make small, believable mistakes so as not to appear freakishly intelligent. It was all part of the act, the careful construction of her new identity. As she sipped her lukewarm tea, her gaze drifted to the calendar on the wall. The last week of June. Her 11th birthday was a few days away, on July 3rd. According to the timeline she held so carefully in her memory, the Hogwarts letters often came around now. The quiet hum of magic in her veins seemed to thrum with a low, expectant energy. She was ready. The week passed in its usual, tranquil rhythm. She helped the younger children with their lessons, spent long hours in the library, and tended to her small, semi-secret garden patch behind the kitchens, where the tomatoes grew suspiciously large and red. With every passing day, the feeling of anticipation grew, a quiet tension coiling in her chest. She found herself watching the postman more intently, her ears straining for the sound of an unfamiliar knock at the door. It came on a Thursday morning. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. The shouts and laughter of the other children at recess were a distant, happy noise. Ariana was inside, helping Mrs. Gable polish the silverware in the main office, a quiet, meditative task she enjoyed. The rhythmic motion was soothing, and the office was the nerve center of the orphanage. From here, you saw everyone who came and went. A sharp, authoritative knock echoed from the heavy oak front door. It wasn't the postman's quick rap or a delivery driver's impatient banging. This knock had weight. It had purpose. Mrs. Gable wiped her hands on her apron. Now who could that be? Stay here, dear. Ariana's hands stilled, a silver fork held forgotten in her grasp. The magic inside her, usually a placid river, stirred. It was as if it could sense a kindred presence, a great and powerful concentration of magic just beyond the door. It was like feeling the air pressure drop before a storm. She heard Mrs. Gable's surprised voice, then the deeper, crisper tones of a woman she had never met in this life, but whose voice she recognized from 1,000 cinematic viewings in her old one. Her heart gave a single, powerful thud against her ribs. "Good morning," the voice said, its Scottish burr precise and unmistakable. "I am here to see a Miss Ariana Dumbledore. My name is Minerva McGonagall." A moment of silence, then Mrs. Gable's slightly flustered reply. "Oh. Oh, of course. Please, come in. Is everything all right?" "Everything is perfectly fine," came the reassuring, if slightly impatient, reply. "I have a matter of school enrollment to discuss with her." Footsteps approached the office. Mrs. Gable appeared in the doorway first, her expression a mixture of confusion and deference. Behind her stood a tall, severe-looking woman who seemed to have stepped directly out of another century. She wore robes of a deep emerald green, her dark hair swept up into a tight, no-nonsense bun. A pair of square-rimmed spectacles were perched on her sharp nose, and behind them, her eyes were keenly intelligent, missing nothing. Minerva McGonagall surveyed the room, her gaze sweeping past the filing cabinets and the worn desk before landing, with laser-like focus, on Ariana. For a split second, an almost imperceptible flicker of something shock? Recognition? Memory, crossed the stern woman's face. It was there and gone in an instant, but Ariana saw it. McGonagall was seeing the face of a ghost. The name, combined with the face, was a potent combination. Ariana placed the fork down soundlessly on the velvet polishing cloth. She stood up, her posture straight, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. She met the professor's intense gaze with her own calm, periwinkle one. "I am Ariana Dumbledore," she said, her voice quiet but clear. McGonagall's lips thinned into a straight line. She gave a curt nod. "Professor McGonagall. I am the deputy headmistress of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry." Mrs. Gable let out a small, bewildered squeak. "Witchcraft? I beg your pardon. Perhaps it would be best if I spoke with Miss Dumbledore alone, Mrs. Gable," McGonagall said, her tone leaving no room for argument. She pulled a straight-backed chair away from the wall and gestured for Ariana to sit, before taking the one behind the desk for herself. Mrs. Gable, looking completely overwhelmed, could only nod. "Yes, of course. I'll just go and check on the children." She scurried out of the room, closing the door softly behind her, leaving Ariana alone with the formidable witch. An intense silence settled over the office. It was a weighted silence, a test. McGonagall was observing her, evaluating her reaction to the bomb she had just dropped. She was likely expecting tears, disbelief, or frightened confusion. She was not expecting the preternatural calm that radiated from the girl in front of her. Finally, McGonagall reached into the sleeve of her robes and produced a thick, yellowish parchment envelope. The address was written in shimmering emerald green ink. Miss A. Dumbledore. The End Armchair, the Library. St. Jude's Orphanage for Girls. London. A small, genuine smile touched Ariana's lips. The end armchair. Of course. Magic. This is for you, McGonagall said, her eyes still fixed on Ariana's face, searching for any sign of a crack in her composure. Ariana accepted the letter. The parchment was heavy, real, a faint tingle of magic vibrating from it into her fingertips. She ran a finger over the wax seal, the perfect impression of the Hogwarts crest, a lion, an eagle, a badger, and a snake intertwined around a large letter H. She broke the seal with a neat crack. Inside, the letter was just as she remembered it would be. The acceptance, the list of required books and equipment. It was her ticket out. Her key to a world she already knew so well, yet was about to experience for the very first time. Hogwarts, Ariana said, her voice soft. It's a school, for people like me. She tilted her head, a carefully crafted look of dawning comprehension on her face. Indeed, McGonagall confirmed. A school for young witches and wizards. Your father, despite his condition, was from a magical family. Your mother was not. It is not uncommon for magic to resurface in a family line. Have you ever noticed things? Things you couldn't explain? This was the critical question. Her chance to set the narrative. She wouldn't lie, not entirely. She would simply frame the truth in a way that fit her persona. She looked down at her hands, then back up at the professor. I feel things, she began, choosing her words with care. It's like a warmth. A current inside me. Sometimes, if I concentrate, I can encourage it. The flowers in the garden grow a little brighter. A scraped knee heals a little faster. A cold cup of tea becomes warm again. I thought it was just something everyone could do if they were quiet enough to notice it. McGonagall's eyebrows rose a fraction. This was not the typical story of accidental magic. There was no mention of exploding teacups or making a bully's hair turn blue. Ariana's description was one of control, of an innate, intuitive connection. It was unusual. It was powerful. You can control it? McGonagall asked, her voice sharp with interest. Control is a strong word, Professor, Ariana replied thoughtfully. It's more like a partnership. It's a part of me. I don't command it. I guide it. She held up her hand and, focusing a minuscule thread of her will, she made a small, forgotten paperweight on the corner of the desk lift an inch into the air. It hovered there for a moment, steady and silent, before she gently set it back down without a sound. McGonagall was silent for a long moment. Her stern facade remained, but Ariana could see a new light in her eyes, respect. And a deep, profound curiosity. Wandless, silent, controlled magic from an untrained 11-year-old was not just unusual, it was nearly unheard of. I see, McGonagall said, her voice a low murmur. She looked at the girl's face again, at the uncanny resemblance to the tragic sister of her oldest friend and colleague. The name Ariana Dumbledore had been a cause for concern when it appeared on the registry. A name freighted with sorrow and whispers of volatile, destructive power. But this girl was the opposite of volatile. She was a placid lake, and somewhere in her depths, a great power resided. Your name, McGonagall said, her tone softening slightly, you were named for a relative of your father's, I believe. Ariana. Ariana met her gaze without flinching. Yes, Professor. My father told me she was a great aunt I never had the chance to meet. He said she was a kind, gentle soul. She delivered the line with perfect, innocent sincerity. It was what a loving, squib father, trying to reclaim a piece of his family's history without the associated pain, might say. A flicker of old sadness passed through McGonagall's eyes. She said, her voice barely above a whisper. She most certainly was. She cleared her throat, her professional mask sliding back into place. Very well, Miss Dumbledore. Welcome to Hogwarts. A representative will be here in 3 days' time to escort you to Diagon Alley to purchase your school supplies. Given your circumstances, the school has a fund to assist with these expenses.
Thank you, Professor, Ariana said, clutching the letter to her chest. It felt like holding the weight of her future, a future she would forge on her own terms. As Professor McGonagall stood to leave, she paused at the door, turning back one last time. She looked at the beautiful, serene girl with the ancient eyes, the girl who bore a haunted name and an impossible face, yet radiated an aura of profound, unshakable peace. I have a feeling, Miss Dumbledore, she said slowly, a thoughtful, almost mystified expression on her face, that you are going to be a most interesting student. And with a final, sharp nod, she was gone, leaving Ariana alone in the quiet office, the scent of magic and old parchment hanging in the air. The story had begun. Not the story from the books, but her story. And she would be the one to write it. Chapter 2, The Alley of Beginnings. The 3 days following Professor McGonagall's visit were a study in quiet, coiled anticipation. For the first time since her arrival in this new reality, Ariana felt a genuine thrum of excitement, a feeling that was purely her own and not just an echo of her former life's memories. The orphanage, once a quiet haven for acclamation, now felt like a waiting room. The faded chintz armchair, the scent of lemon polish, the gentle rhythm of life, it had all become the before. What was coming was the after. She spent the time preparing, not with frantic energy, but with the calm, methodical precision of the architect she once was. She read through the Hogwarts letter and the equipment list a dozen times, not for information, but to solidify the reality of it in her mind. She committed the names of the books to memory, cross-referencing them with the knowledge from her past life. A History of Magic by Bathilda Bagshot, a woman Albus Dumbledore knew intimately. Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them by Newt Scamander, a man who had been at the center of the conflict involving Grindelwald and, tangentially, the original Ariana. The names were not just names, they were connections, threads in a web she was only just beginning to perceive from the inside. On the third morning, a Saturday, she was ready. She had dressed with care in her best, plainest dress of dark blue cotton. She had brushed her honey blonde hair until it shone like spun silk, letting it hang loose down her back. It was a conscious choice. Her appearance was a tool, a statement. She looked ethereal, innocent, yet her posture and the unnerving calm in her periwinkle eyes projected an aura of quiet authority. She sat on the steps of the orphanage's main entrance, a book open but unread in her lap, and waited. She felt his approach before she heard it. The ambient magic of the world, usually a gentle hum, seemed to ripple, parting around a large, approaching presence. It was a magic that felt warm, wild, and deeply, fundamentally good. Then came the sound, a knock on the great oak door so thunderous it seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. The little glass panes on either side of the door rattled in their frames, and from inside, a few of the younger girls shrieked in surprise. The door was wrenched open by a flustered Mrs. Gable, who gasped and took a full step back. Filling the entire doorway, and then some, was a man who could only be described as a giant. He was at least twice as tall as a normal man and 3 times as wide, with a great, tangled mane of black hair and a beard that completely hid his face, save for 2 shining, black beetle-like eyes that crinkled with kindness. He was dressed in a moleskin overcoat with more pockets than seemed possible. "Rubius Hagrid," he boomed, his voice a deep, rumbling bass that vibrated in Ariana's bones. "Here for Miss Dumbledore." As the giant shifted slightly to one side, Ariana saw him. Hiding behind one of the man's colossal legs was a small, skinny boy with unruly black hair that stuck up at all angles, a pair of round, broken glasses held together with tape, and brilliant green eyes that were wide with a mixture of terror and awe. He was swimming in clothes that were several sizes too large, cast-offs from a much larger boy. This was him. Harry Potter. The boy who lived. In her past life, he had been a hero, a figure of literary legend. Seeing him now,
in the flesh, Ariana's first thought was not of prophecy or destiny. It was a sharp, painful pang of empathy. He wasn't a hero. He was a child. A neglected, underfed, and clearly overwhelmed child who had just been ripped from his own reality. Her carefully constructed composure felt a flicker of something fierce and protective. Hagrid's beetle-black eyes scanned the porch and landed on her. His jaw went slack beneath the forest of his beard. The booming confidence seemed to evaporate, replaced by a stunned, profound silence. He stared at her face, at her hair, at her eyes, and his own eyes began to glisten. "Merlin's beard," he whispered, the sound a raw, emotional rumble. It's just like her portrait." Albus said, "but I never imagined." He took a half-step forward, his gaze full of a sorrow so old and deep it felt ancient. "Ya look just like her. Just like his sister." He seemed to catch himself, shaking his massive head as if to clear it. "Beggin' your pardon, Miss name's Hagrid, Keeper of Keys and Grounds at Hogwarts. It's an honor. A real honor." Ariana rose gracefully from the step, closing her book. "It is a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Hagrid," she said, her voice calm and steady, a gentle anchor in the sea of his emotion. She then turned her gaze to the small boy behind him, offering him a soft, reassuring smile. "And you must be Harry." Harry just stared, first at the giant, then at the girl who looked like she'd stepped out of a fairy tale. He gave a small, jerky nod, too overwhelmed to speak. The journey to London was a whirlwind of mundane absurdity clashing with burgeoning magic. Hagrid insisted on taking the tube, a feat that involved him taking up nearly 3 seats and drawing stares from every passenger. He counted the Muggle money with immense concentration, his huge fingers struggling with the small coins. Through it all, Ariana sat with serene poise, a beacon of tranquility next to Hagrid's booming, affable chaos. She engaged Harry in quiet conversation, asking simple questions about his school, his favorite subject, anything to draw him out of his shell and ground him. She learned he liked drawing and was surprisingly good at it, a small detail the books had never mentioned. They arrived at the Leaky Cauldron, a shabby-looking pub squeezed between a bookshop and a record store. To any other Muggle, it would have been invisible. But Ariana could feel it, a thrum of magic so concentrated it made the air feel thick and heavy, like just before a thunderstorm. Inside, the pub was dark and dingy, but full of a strange, captivating energy. The patrons, a bizarre collection of wizened old crones and cloaked wizards, fell silent as they entered. All eyes went to Hagrid, then to the famous scar peeking out from under Harry's messy fringe, and finally, to Ariana. Her ethereal beauty and uncanny resemblance to a figure of historical tragedy, combined with the Dumbledore name that would surely spread like wildfire, made them a spectacle. "The usual, Hagrid?" a toothless wizard behind the bar asked. "Can't, Tom, I'm on Hogwarts business," Hagrid said proudly, puffing out his chest. He led them through the pub to a small, walled courtyard at the back. He stood before a brick wall, counted bricks 3 up, 2 across and tapped the wall 3 times with his pink umbrella. The effect was instantaneous and breathtaking. A small hole appeared, widening and growing, bricks folding and sliding away from each other to form a grand, sweeping archway. Beyond it lay a cobbled street, twisting and turning out of sight, lined with the most fantastical shops she had ever seen. Cauldrons were stacked in gleaming piles, owl cages twittered from storefronts, and robes of every color imaginable hung on display. "Diagon Alley!" Harry gasped, his green eyes wider than Ariana had ever seen them. It was a pure, unadulterated moment of wonder, and she felt a genuine smile grace her lips as she watched him. For her, the sight was one of profound, validating reality. It was real. All of it. The hum of magic in her veins seemed to sing in harmony with the ambient magic of the alley. "First stop," Hagrid announced, his voice filled with importance, "Gringotts. The Wizard Bank. No safer place, except perhaps Hogwarts." Gringotts was an imposing snow-white building that towered over the other shops. Inside, stern-faced goblins with long fingers and clever, dark eyes were perched on high stools, weighing jewels and scribbling in ledgers. The sheer weight of ancient wealth and suspicion in the room was palpable. Harry was visibly intimidated. Ariana, however, looked at the goblins with the analytical eye of an architect and a strategist. These were not monsters, they were the masters of a powerful institution, sharp, intelligent, and not to be underestimated. She offered a brief, respectful nod to the goblin they approached, a gesture that was of respect to the creature. Hagrid presented Harry's key and a sealed letter from Dumbledore regarding Vault 713. For Ariana, he produced another letter. From Professor McGonagall, he explained to the goblin, for Miss Dumbledore's school expenses. From the Hogwarts Fund. Also access to her own vault, set up by Professor Dumbledore himself. The goblin, whose nameplate read Griphook, took the letter. His dark eyes flickered to Ariana, and his eyebrows raised infinitesimally as he read her name on the parchment. Dumbledore, he stated, the name sounding like stones grinding together. An unusual coincidence of name and appearance. His gaze was sharp, assessing. He had clearly heard the old stories. Life is full of unusual coincidences, Ariana replied smoothly, her voice betraying no emotion. Griphook gave a sharp, toothy grin that was not entirely pleasant. Indeed. The cart ride to the vaults was a dizzying, exhilarating plunge into the earth's depths. Wind roared past them as the cart twisted and careened along the tracks. Harry whooped with a mixture of fear and delight. Hagrid looked increasingly green. Ariana simply held on, her long hair whipping around her, a small, genuine smile on her face. The sensation of speed, of plunging into the unknown, was thrilling. They stopped first at Harry's vault. The sight of the small mountain of gold, silver, and bronze coins was staggering. It was the legacy of the Potter family, a fortune the boy had never known he possessed. Ariana watched him, seeing the shock and confusion on his face. It was another layer of his new identity, another weight to place on his small shoulders. Ariana's own vault was far more modest. It was a small, secure locker that Griphook opened with a master key. Inside sat several neat stacks of galleons, sickles, and nuts. It was a generous amount, more than enough for her supplies, with a significant sum left over. Dumbledore, it seemed, was ensuring his namesake would want for nothing. She methodically scooped the coins into a leather pouch Hagrid provided, her movements efficient and practical. Their final stop was the high-security Vault 713. It was empty, save for a grubby little package wrapped in brown paper, which Hagrid tucked deep into his coat. Ariana knew what it was. The Philosopher's Stone. The first great test for the boy standing beside her. Seeing it, feeling the faint, ancient magic pulsing from the parcel, made the future feel terrifyingly, exhilaratingly real. Back in the bright sunlight of the alley, their first proper stop was Madame Malkin's robes for all occasions. As they entered the shop, a squat, smiling witch bustled forward. "Hogwarts, dears," she chirped. "Got the lot right here." Another boy was already being fitted, standing on a stool in the back. He had a pale, pointed face and sleek, white blonde hair. His voice was a bored, arrogant drawl. "Draco Malfoy. And my father says it's a crime if they let the other sort in," he was saying. "You know, the ones who haven't been brought up to know our ways. They're just not the same." He caught sight of Harry and Hagrid, his nose wrinkling in disdain at Hagrid's size and scruffy appearance. Then his gaze fell upon Ariana. He stopped talking. His pale grey eyes widened slightly, taking in her striking beauty and poised demeanor. "Hello," Malfoy said, his arrogant tone shifting to something smoother, more inquisitive. "Hogwarts, too?" "Yes," Harry mumbled, looking uncomfortable. Ariana simply inclined her head in a silent acknowledgement, her periwinkle eyes coolly assessing him. She saw not a menacing villain, but a spoiled, insecure child puffing himself up with his father's rhetoric. My father's next door buying my books and my mother's up the street looking at wands, Malfoy boasted. Then I'm going to drag them off to look at racing brooms. I don't see why first years can't have their own. I think I'll bully father into getting me one and I'll smuggle it in somehow. He looked from Harry's ill-fitting clothes to Ariana's simple but neat dress. What are your surnames? Harry was about to answer when Ariana spoke, her voice quiet yet carrying an undeniable weight in the small shop. I am Ariana Dumbledore. Malfoy's jaw literally dropped. The color drained from his pale face. Dumbledore, he stammered, his eyes wide with shock and a hint of fear. The name was synonymous with power, with everything his father railed against. He stared at her, then at Harry, clearly trying to process this information. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, for once rendered speechless. Madame Malkin finished with him shortly after, and he scurried out of the shop with a final, confused glance back at them. After being fitted for their standard black robes, Ariana turned to the witch. Madame Malkin, she said, her tone polite but firm, I'll need more than just school robes. I require a full wardrobe. Hagrid looked surprised. A full wardrobe? But the list just says. I have no other clothes that fit me properly, Mr. Hagrid, Ariana stated simply. It was the truth. It would be impractical to arrive at school with only a single set of non-uniform clothes. Madame Malkin beamed, her eyes lighting up at the prospect of a larger sale. Over the next hour, Ariana, with the detached efficiency of a seasoned shopper, selected a capsule wardrobe. She chose practical, high-quality items in muted tones: dark trousers, simple blouses of cream and grey silk, woolen jumpers, a sturdy traveling cloak, and comfortable, well-made boots. It was a wardrobe that spoke of quiet elegance and self-sufficiency, not childish whimsy. She was building a new life, and she intended to be properly equipped for it. Their final, most anticipated stop was the narrow, shabby shop with peeling gold letters that read, Ollivanders, makers of fine wands since 382 BC. The air inside was thick with a magic so ancient it felt like breathing in dust and secrets. Thousands of narrow boxes were stacked to the ceiling. A soft, tinkling bell announced their arrival, and from the shadowy depths of the shop, a man emerged. Garrick Ollivander's wide, silvery eyes were unsettling, giving the impression that he saw not just them, but the very fabric of their beings. He looked at Harry first, a flicker of recognition in his gaze. Harry Potter, he breathed. I knew I'd be seeing you one day. Then his gaze shifted to Ariana, and he froze. His silvery eyes widened, and he seemed to pale. My word, he whispered, his voice full of disbelief. Ariana Dumbledore. It cannot be. The name, and the face. A ghost from a sad old story. The story is over, Ariana said, her voice soft but firm. I am here for a wand. Ollivander stared at her for a long moment, his mind clearly reeling. Finally, he shook his head as if waking from a dream and turned his professional attention to Harry. You first, Mr. Potter. What followed was the chaotic dance Ariana remembered from the books. Wands were tried and rejected, causing drawers to fly open and vases of flowers to shatter. Finally, Ollivander returned with a specific box. Holly and Phoenix feather, 11 inches, nice and supple. The moment Harry took the wand, a shower of red and gold sparks flew from its tip, and a warm feeling spread through the shop. A perfect match. Ollivander then delivered the chilling reveal, the phoenix whose feather resided in Harry's wand had given one other feather. Just one. It was in the wand of Lord Voldemort. After the profound gravity of that revelation, it was Ariana's turn. Ollivander approached her with a renewed, intense curiosity. Now, Miss Dumbledore. Your turn. I confess, I am more intrigued than I have been in a great many years. He began with standard wands. A 10-inch willow with a unicorn hair core felt like a dead stick in her hand. A 12¼ inch maple with dragon heartstring felt actively hostile, vibrating with a resentful energy. He brought out wand after wand. Some did nothing. Others sent sparks flying that fizzled out into sad puffs of smoke. One, a powerful ebony and dragon heartstring, flew out of her hand and embedded itself in the ceiling. Hagrid and Harry watched, mesmerized, as the pile of rejected wands grew on the counter. Ollivander, far from being discouraged, grew more and more excited, his silvery eyes gleaming. "Fascinating," he chirped, pulling out a measuring tape that began zipping around Ariana of its own accord. "Your magic, it is not a thing you simply have, Miss Dumbledore. It is what you are. It is woven into you, deep and strong and placid. It refuses to be channeled by a vessel that is not precisely attuned to its nature. It demands a perfect conduit, or none at all." He bustled back into the depths of his shop, muttering to himself. No, not that, too brittle, too fickle." He returned empty-handed, looking at her with an expression of profound contemplation. "There is no wand for you in this shop, Miss Dumbledore," he announced, a note of triumph in his voice. "No pre-made wand would ever be worthy of you. We must craft one." Hagrid looked stunned. "Craft one? I've never heard of such a thing. It is rare, but for the most singular of witches and wizards, it is the only way," Ollivander said, his eyes fixed on Ariana. "The wood must be chosen first. It needs a wood of immense power, of history, of destiny. A wood that commands rather than serves." He paused, a dramatic flair in his gesture. "It must be elder." The name hung in the air. Hagrid and Harry looked blank, but Ariana's heart gave a jolt. Elder. The wood of the death stick, the wand of destiny. She would not possess the elder wand, but one made of its same substance. The symbolism was staggering. "And the core," Ollivander continued, pacing now. "It cannot be unicorn, for your magic is not purely innocent. It cannot be dragon, for it is not born of fire and rage. Nor phoenix, for it is not a cycle of death and rebirth. No, your magic is like the sky before a great storm. Calm, immense, holding untold power in reserve." His eyes lit up. "It must be the tail feather of a thunderbird." "A thunderbird?" Harry whispered. "A great, magical American bird," Ollivander explained, his voice full of reverence. "It creates storms as it flies. Its feathers are notoriously difficult to work with, immensely powerful, and said to be sensitive to danger. A wand with a thunderbird core is potent, but it chooses its master with extreme prejudice. It is a wand for a weaver of elements, a master of their own will." He looked at Ariana, a broad, triumphant smile on his face. "Elder wood, with the thunderbird tail feather core. A wand of immense power, for a witch of immense potential. It will be my masterpiece." He informed her that crafting such a wand would take time. It was a delicate, dangerous process. He would send it via owl to Hogwarts when it was complete and had accepted her as its mistress. They left the shop, stepping back into the bustling alley. Harry was looking at her with a new level of awe. Hagrid was simply shaking his massive head in bewilderment. Ariana herself was silent, her mind racing. An elder wand with the heart of a storm. It was more than a tool. It was a declaration. The world of magic had just met her, and it had already decided she was a force to be reckoned with. Her quiet, carefully planned journey was already becoming something far grander, and far more conspicuous, than she had ever intended. Chapter 3, The Weaver and the Void. The air in Ollivander's had been thick with the weight of destiny, a silence punctuated by the shocking pronouncements of elderwood and thunderbird feather. Stepping back out into the cacophonous vibrancy of Diagon Alley was like surfacing from a deep, ancient sea. The sunlight seemed brighter, the chatter of the crowd sharper. Harry was looking at her, his green eyes wide behind his glasses, a new and profound awe replacing his earlier bewilderment. He had just been told his own wand was the brother to a Dark Lord's, a heavy burden to bear, yet the revelation about Ariana's unmade wand seemed to have eclipsed even that. It was something else entirely, not a dark history, but a future of untold, unprecedented power. Hagrid, for his part, seemed to be struggling to reconcile the quiet, beautiful girl beside him with the earth-shattering potential Ollivander had described. He cleared his throat, the sound a low rumble, and consulted his list, a gesture of someone desperately seeking normalcy in the face of the extraordinary. "Right," he boomed, his voice a little strained. "Well, that's that, then. All that's left on your lists is a pet. You can have an owl, or a cat, or a toad." He seemed to brighten at the thought of this simple, straightforward task. "Let's get that done, eh? Best place for it is the magical menagerie." He led them down the winding cobbled street to a shop that was, to put it mildly, a sensory assault. The magical menagerie was crammed, noisy, and pungent. The air was thick with the mingled smells of damp fur, sawdust, and something vaguely sulphurous. A cacophony of hoots, squeaks, hisses, and croaks filled the space, emanating from dozens of cages stacked from floor to ceiling. A pair of enormous purple toads were lazily catching flies with their long tongues near the entrance, and a cage of flobberworms sat looking profoundly uninteresting. Harry was immediately drawn to the owls, his face lighting up with a pure, boyish delight that Ariana found herself smiling at. It was a relief to see him look like a child, not a burdened hero. He moved towards a section of the shop where magnificent owls of every size and color, snowy, barn, tawny, eagle, were perched, regarding the customers with wise, swiveling heads. Ariana, however, felt a different pull. The ambient magic she sensed in Diagon Alley was a chaotic symphony, but here in the menagerie, it was a discordant mess of countless small, buzzing life forces. Yet, through the noise, she felt a single, clear note. It was a sliver of magic, quiet and cool and deep, like a pool of still water in a dark cave. It was completely different from the warm, wild magic of Hagrid, the latent, lightning in a bottle power of Harry, or her own placid, oceanic depths. This was something else. Something, void-like. She followed the feeling, her steps silent and fluid as she navigated the cramped aisles. She passed the cages of Krups yapping with their forked tails, the iridescent fire crabs, and the chattering ginger cats. The pole led her to a quiet, shadowed corner at the very back of the shop. There, in a small, simple cage, sat a cat. It was tiny, barely more than a kitten, and utterly, completely black. Its fur was short and sleek, seeming to drink the light around it, leaving it looking like a perfect, cat-shaped hole in reality. Most black cats had a hint of tabby striping in bright light, or a touch of brown. This one did not. It was the color of midnight in a moonless sky. As she approached, the cat looked up. Its eyes were the most startling feature. They were not green or yellow, the typical colors for a black cat. They were a deep, luminous violet, the color of a twilight sky just after the sun has vanished. There was an intelligence in that gaze, a knowing stillness that was profoundly unnerving and deeply compelling. The quiet hum of magic she'd been tracking pulsed from the small creature. It felt ancient, patient, and powerful in a way that had nothing to do with size or aggression. While her own magic was a vast, woven tapestry of energy, this cat's was a perfect, contained vacuum, a point of pure potential. "Hello there," Ariana whispered. She unlatched the cage door and reached in slowly. The cat didn't hiss or back away. It watched her hand approach with its incredible violet eyes, then it leaned forward and pressed its head firmly into her palm. A purr started, but it wasn't a normal sound. It was a low, resonant vibration that seemed to hum not in the air, but directly inside her own magical core. Her placid inner sea of magic stirred, rippling in response to the cat's touch, a perfect harmony of presence and absence. They fit. The shopkeeper, a harried-looking witch with spectacles perched on the end of her nose, bustled over. "Oh! Be careful with that one, dear. She's a strange one. Hasn't taken to anyone. Just sits there. Doesn't even eat much." "I'll take her," Ariana said, her voice leaving no room for discussion. She gently lifted the small cat from the cage. It was light as a feather but felt substantial, as if it weighed more than mere flesh and bone. It immediately curled up in the crook of her arm, tucking its head under her chin, its strange purr a constant, soothing vibration against her skin. "What will you name her?" Harry asked. He had returned, a magnificent snowy owl perched regally on his arm. The owl was beautiful, a creature of stark white purity, and the joy on Harry's face was a sight to behold. He had found a friend, a connection to this new world. Ariana looked down at the void-black fur of the creature nestled against her. "Midnight," she said. It was the only name that felt right. Hagrid paid for both pets, looking immensely pleased with Harry's choice, and only slightly bewildered by Ariana's. A snowy owl was a fine, respectable wizarding pet. The tiny, unnervingly still black cat was another enigma to add to the growing list associated with Miss Dumbledore. Their arms now full, Hagrid carrying most of the parcels, Harry his owl cage, and Ariana cradling Midnight. Their final destination was the bookshop. Flourish and Blots was a haven. The scent of old paper and leather-bound ink was a balm after the chaos of the menagerie. Books were stacked to the ceiling on groaning shelves, in teetering piles on the floor, and behind glass cases. It was a treasure trove, and the architect-scholar within Ariana felt a deep sense of coming home. They gathered the required first-year texts with relative ease, the Standard Book of Spells, Grade 1, A Beginner's Guide to Transfiguration, 1000 Magical Herbs and Fungi. Harry looked at the titles with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. For him, they were gateways to a world he never knew existed. For Ariana, they were refreshers, the basic building blocks of a system she was already beginning to understand on a far more intuitive level. Once they had the required stack, Harry and Hagrid assumed they were finished. But Ariana did not move towards the counter. Instead, her gaze swept over the towering shelves, her eyes scanning titles with a focused intensity. "Is there something else you need, Ariana?" Hagrid asked, shifting a precarious pile of cauldrons in his arms. "Yes," she said, her attention fixed on a dusty, shadowed section of the store labeled Theoretical and Abstract Arcana. "The list is for what we are required to learn. I am more interested in understanding why we are required to learn it." Leaving Hagrid and Harry near the front of the store, she navigated the labyrinthine aisles with a sure-footedness that suggested she knew exactly what she was looking for. Midnight remained asleep in her arm, a small, dark patch of absolute stillness. Ariana's fingers, long and delicate, trailed along the spines of ancient, heavy tomes. The knowledge she possessed from her past life was a map, but it was a map of events, of people and their actions. It was not a map of the fundamental laws of this universe. Her innate ability to weave magic felt like speaking a language she was born knowing, but she had no knowledge of its grammar, its syntax, its deep etymological roots. She needed the grammar. She pulled out a thick, dense book bound in dark blue leather, Axioms of Arcanum, From Will to Reality. Its pages felt heavy with complex thought. She found another, smaller volume called The Unifying Principles of Intent, which seemed to discuss the very nature of a witch or wizard's will as the catalyst for all magical effects. These were the books on theory she craved. They would provide the framework for the instinct she already possessed. Then, her eyes landed on a title that made the architect's soul inside her sing. It was a slim, elegant book with a silver embossed cover depicting a hand shaping a swirling cloud of energy into a solid object. The title was Weaving the World, a primer on foundational creation. Beside it was a more advanced-looking text, The Art of Artifice, an introduction to magical construction. This was it. Not just transfiguration, which was the art of changing one thing into another, but creation. The art of bringing something into existence from nothing but will and magic. It was the magical equivalent of architecture, of taking a concept, a blueprint in the mind, and making it manifest. It was a branch of magic that was barely touched upon in the original stories, considered incredibly advanced and difficult. To Ariana, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. It was what she did, on a small scale, when she encouraged a flower to grow or warmed a cup of tea. She was weaving new states of being. She gathered the 4 extra books and returned to the front of the shop. Hagrid's eyes widened when he saw the additional, heavy volumes. "Blimey, Ariana," he said, his brow furrowed. "Those look a bit advanced. Are ye sure about that? First year's gonna be busy enough as it is." Ariana met his concerned gaze with her usual, unshakable calm. "Professor McGonagall mentioned that my connection to magic was unusual, Mr. Hagrid," she said, her voice soft but her reasoning impeccable. "I don't just want to learn how to do spells. I want to understand the how and the why behind them. If my magic works differently, then I need to understand the principles, not just the practice." She paused, then added, "It's just for my own curiosity. I enjoy reading." Her explanation was so mature, so perfectly reasonable, that Hagrid found he had no counter-argument. He looked from the serious, intelligent girl to the stack of esoteric books, then back again. He remembered Ollivander's words about her magic, about how it was what she was. Perhaps she really did need these. "A Dumbledore, through and through," he muttered, shaking his head in fond bewilderment. "Thirst for knowledge, the lot of M. Albus is the same. Always with his nose in a book." He seemed to accept her reasoning completely, his comparison to the current headmaster the highest form of praise he could offer. He paid for the books, adding them to their now mountainous collection of supplies. As they finally left Flourish and Blots, stepping back into the dwindling afternoon light of the alley, Ariana felt a profound sense of completeness. In one arm, she held a creature that was a quiet echo of the void, a silent, magical anchor. In her other, she held books that contained the foundational secrets of the universe she now inhabited. She had her school robes, her supplies, and the promise of a wand forged from legend and storm. She glanced at Harry, who was gazing at his snowy owl with a look of pure, unadulterated happiness. He had his first ever birthday present, his first real friend. He was on the path the world had laid for him. Ariana, however, was on a path of her own making. She held the tools not just to survive in this world, but to understand it, to shape it. The quiet confidence she had cultivated in the orphanage solidified into something harder, something more certain. She was no longer just a transmigrated soul trying to adapt. She was a scholar, a weaver, an architect of her own destiny. And she was ready to begin construction. Chapter 4, The Principles of Being. The return to St. Jude's was like stepping from a world painted in vibrant, impossible colors back into one rendered in soft charcoal. The clamor and raw, chaotic magic of Diagon Alley faded behind them, replaced by the familiar quiet of the orphanage, the scent of beeswax, and the distant laughter of children in the garden. For Harry, who was dropped off at the Dursleys by a reluctant Hagrid, it was a return to a cage, albeit a temporary one. For Ariana, it was a return to her sanctuary, a place where she could now process, analyze, and integrate the monumental influx of new information and potential. Mrs. Gable met her at the door, her expression a whirlwind of curiosity, concern, and awe. She had seen the giant of a man, and she saw the small, impossibly black cat now cradled in Ariana's arms. She didn't ask about the school for witchcraft. Professor McGonagall's authoritative presence had left a deep impression, one that suggested it was a topic not to be questioned but simply accepted, like a royal decree. "Oh, my dear," the matron fussed, her eyes wide. "You're back. And you have a cat." "Her name is Midnight," Ariana said, her voice a calm anchor in the woman's gentle storm of confusion. "She's very quiet." Midnight lifted her head and blinked her luminous violet eyes at Mrs. Gable. The matron flinched back almost imperceptibly, unsettled by the unnerving intelligence in the animal's gaze. She quickly recovered with a slightly strained smile. "Well, she's very black. I'll fetch a saucer of milk for her." "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Gable, but she doesn't seem to care for milk," Ariana replied smoothly. "Water is fine. I'll take her up to my room. I have a great deal of reading to do before school starts." With that, she retreated from the well-meaning but mundane world of the orphanage's main floor and ascended the creaking stairs to her private haven. Her room was small and simple, containing little more than a narrow bed, a small wooden wardrobe, and a desk by the window that overlooked the back garden. It was a blank slate, and she had just returned with the palette and pigments to paint a masterpiece. She placed her Diagon Alley purchases on the floor, the neat stack of school supplies, the practical and elegant wardrobe, and, most importantly, the towering pile of books. At the very top sat the four she had chosen for herself, their titles promising not just knowledge, but true understanding. Midnight leaped silently from her arms onto the bed, curling into a perfect, dark circle on the patchwork quilt, her violet eyes tracking Ariana's every move. There was an immediate sense of rightness to the cat's presence in the room, as if a missing piece of the space had finally been slotted into place. The weeks that followed fell into a deep, focused rhythm. To the rest of the orphanage, Ariana became even more of a recluse, a quiet, studious girl who spent nearly all her time in her room, emerging only for meals. They would see her in the library or sitting in the garden, a heavy, ancient-looking book in her lap, her strange black cat a constant, silent shadow at her side. They saw a girl preparing for a new, exclusive boarding school. They had no concept of the reality. Inside her room, Ariana was not merely studying, she was deconstructing the universe. She began with axioms of arcanum, from will to reality. It was not a spellbook. It was a work of pure magical philosophy and physics, and for her architect's mind, it was the most thrilling text she had ever encountered. The book laid out the fundamental triad of magical manifestation, intentio, anima mundi, and materia. Intentio, the book explained, was will. Not mere wanting or wishing, but a focused, absolute, and unwavering projection of purpose from the witch or wizard. It was the blueprint, the architectural drawing of the desired effect. The book stressed that a weak or divided intentio was the reason for most magical failures, a spell that fizzled, a transfiguration that was incomplete. Your will had to be singular, a rapier-sharp point of focus. Ariana understood this on a primal level. When she had encouraged the flowers to grow, she hadn't just wished them to be healthier. She had, for a moment, held a perfect, idealized image of the rose in her mind, its form, its color, its vitality, and projected that reality onto the plant. She had been drafting a new blueprint for its existence. Anima mundi, or the world soul, was the term the book used for magic itself. It described it not as an energy to be commanded, but as a universal medium, an omnipresent substrate that connected all things, living and non-living. It was the raw material, the clay, the stone, the steel from which reality was built. A witch or wizard did not create magic, they were a unique form of materia with the innate ability to shape the anima mundi through their intentio. This resonated with her profoundly. It explained the constant, low hum she felt in her blood. It wasn't just her magic. It was her connection, her resonant frequency with the universal medium. She was a natural conduit, a weaver born with an intuitive feel for the threads of existence. Finally, there was materia, physical reality. The final, tangible result. The true art, the book argued, was in making the transition from intentio to materia as seamless as possible, with the anima mundi as the flawless conduit. The more complex the desired change in materia, the more exquisitely detailed and powerful the intentio must be. She put the theories into practice with small, silent experiments in the privacy of her room. She took a cup of water from her bedside and, focusing her intentio, she didn't try to freeze it. Instead, she visualized the molecular structure of the water, the H2O molecules slowing, their kinetic energy bleeding away, until they locked into the crystalline lattice of ice. She held the blueprint in her mind, clear and perfect, and pushed it into the water via the anima mundi that thrummed at her fingertips. A thin sheet of ice instantly formed on the surface, perfectly smooth, without a single bubble or imperfection. She then reversed the process, and the ice melted back into cool water. It was exhausting, requiring immense concentration, but it was exhilarating. It was not a trick. It was applied physics, with magic as the force. Her other books built upon this foundation. The Unifying Principles of Intent was a deep dive into the nature of will, with chapters on emotional congruence, mental clarity, and the dangers of a fractured psyche when performing powerful magic. It explained why dark magic was so corrosive it required an intentio fueled by hatred, cruelty, or a desire for domination, and projecting such intense, negative blueprints inevitably stained the soul of the caster. But it was Weaving the World, a primer on foundational creation that truly captured her heart. This wasn't about changing what already existed, it was about creation ex nihilo, from the void. The book described the process as creating a scaffold of pure will and then spooling the threads of the anima mundi onto that frame until it coalesced into materia. It was the ultimate act of architecture. Her first attempt was simple. She closed her eyes, and in her mind, she drafted the blueprint for a small, perfect sphere of light. Not just light, but a specific wavelength, a specific brightness, a specific size about the size of a marble. She imagined it hovering an inch above her open palm. Holding this perfect, unwavering intentio, she opened her inner senses to the anima mundi, the humming energy all around her. She felt it pool in her chest, then flow down her arm. Gently, she began to weave it, thread by invisible thread, onto the mental scaffold she had built. A soft warmth grew above her palm. A faint glow appeared, coalesced, and then solidified. She opened her eyes. Hovering silently above her hand was a perfect, self-contained sphere of warm, golden light. It didn't flicker. It didn't radiate heat. It was a stable, solid construct of magic. She held it for a full minute before she let her intentio dissolve. The sphere unraveled back into the unseen medium of the anima mundi, vanishing without a sound. Throughout all of this, Midnight was her silent, watchful companion. The little cat seemed to thrive on the ambient magic Ariana manipulated. When Ariana practiced, Midnight's purr would deepen, and her violet eyes would seem to glow with a soft inner light. She was a strange creature. She never made a mess, she ate the small morsels of food Ariana brought her with a delicate, almost regal grace, and she never made a sound beyond her resonant purr. The first sign that Midnight was more than she appeared came subtly. Ariana noticed that the shadows in her room seemed deeper, cooler, when Midnight was present. One afternoon, while engrossed in a particularly complex chapter, she looked up to find the cat sunning herself on the windowsill. A moment later, a sudden noise in the hallway drew her attention. When she looked back, Midnight was no longer on the windowsill. She was curled up on the pillow at the head of her bed, a good 10 feet away, with no discernible sound of her having moved. Ariana blinked, a slight frown touching her brow. It was impossible, yet it had happened. The true revelation came late one night, about a week before she was due to leave for King's Cross. A thunderstorm was raging outside, a dramatic percussion to the quiet theater of her room. Rain lashed against the windowpane, and flashes of lightning periodically bleached the room in stark white and deep shadow. Ariana was sitting cross-legged on her bed, deep in concentration. She was reading The Art of Artifice, the advanced creation text, and attempting her most complex weaving yet. She was trying to repair a small crack in a ceramic mug, not by filling it, but by persuading the materia of the mug to reweave itself, to forget the crack had ever existed. It required a level of detail in her intentio that was staggering. She had to visualize the molecular bonds of the ceramic, the glaze, the pigments. As she focused, the hum of her own magic intensified, filling the small room with a palpable pressure. Midnight, who had been a small, dark lump at the foot of the bed, lifted her head, her violet eyes fixed on Ariana. The cat's strange purr deepened, becoming a low thrum that seemed to harmonize with the rumbling thunder outside. A particularly bright flash of lightning illuminated the room, casting long, sharp shadows. And in that moment of stark contrast, something impossible happened. The shadow cast by the bed seemed to rise up. It pooled and swirled around Midnight, not like a normal shadow, but like a viscous, living fluid. The small, cat-shaped form began to stretch, to elongate, to expand in utter, complete silence. There was no sound of growing bone or stretching muscle, only the hiss of the rain and the rumble of thunder. Ariana's concentration on the mug shattered. Her jaw went slack as she watched in silent, profound astonishment. The creature on her bed was no longer a kitten. Its form swelled, the light swallowing fur remaining a perfect, seamless void as it grew. Slender legs became thick, powerful limbs tipped with formidable claws that remained sheathed. The delicate body filled out, bunching with the dense, ropey muscle of a predator. The head remained elegantly shaped, but larger, with a jaw that now clearly held immense power. When the transformation was complete, the creature that lay on her bed was a panther. A small one, perhaps, but a panther nonetheless, sleek and powerful and utterly black. It was easily 5 feet long from nose to tail, its body a study in fluid, deadly grace. It blinked its huge, luminous violet eyes at her, and the intelligence within them was no longer just unnerving, it was ancient and undeniable. It let out a soft huff of air, and the purr that followed was a bass vibration that shivered the very mattress beneath them. Any other child would have screamed. They would have scrambled away in terror. Ariana did not move. Her initial shock gave way to a wave of pure, unadulterated wonder. The architect in her admired the perfect, fluid transformation. The scholar in her immediately began cross-referencing this phenomenon with everything she had read. It wasn't a transfiguration, the panther's being felt fundamental, not temporary. It was a creature of shadow and magic, and the small cat form was merely a guise, a convenience. Slowly, she reached out a hand. The panther watched the movement, then leaned forward, pressing its massive, velvety head into her palm with the same gentle familiarity it had shown as a cat. The scale was different, but the gesture was the same. This was her Midnight. A shadow panther, Ariana whispered, the name coming to her mind from some half-remembered passage in Fantastic Beasts. A rare, elusive magical creature said to be born of concentrated shadow and to bond with only the most powerful or unusual of magic users. As if to confirm her conclusion, Midnight shifted. She did not stand and walk. Instead, she seemed to dissolve. Her solid form melted into the deepest shadow in the corner of the room, sinking into it like black ink into black paper. For a moment, she was gone. Then, from the shadow under Ariana's desk across the room, she re-emerged, flowing back into solid form with a silent, liquid grace. Ariana let out a soft, breathy laugh. It was a sound of pure delight. "Well," she said to the magnificent creature now sitting by her desk. "That is certainly more interesting than an owl." From that night on, a new routine was established. During the day, or whenever she left her room, Midnight would shrink back down to the size of a small, unassuming black cat. But at night, in the privacy of their sanctuary, she would allow her true form to emerge. The image became the defining tableau of Ariana's final days at the orphanage. She would sit propped against the pillows on her bed, one of her advanced magical tomes resting in her lap, the lamplight casting a warm, golden glow on the pages. Curled protectively around her was a great, black panther, a creature of living shadow and silent power. Midnight's massive head would be resting in Ariana's lap, her violet eyes half closed in contentment, a deep, earth-shaking purr vibrating through them both as Ariana's free hand idly stroked the impossible, light-devouring softness of her fur. She was Ariana Dumbledore. A girl with a ghost's face and a calm and mature soul, a weaver of the very fabric of being, guarded by a creature born from the void. She was ready for Hogwarts. Chapter 5, The Threshold of Beginnings. The final morning at St. Jude's was tinged with a quiet, surreal sense of finality. Ariana woke early, the grey pre-dawn light filtering through her window. Midnight was already in her small cat form, a tiny patch of perfect darkness perched on the windowsill, her violet eyes watching the city slowly awaken. The air in the room was still, holding the lingering scent of old paper from her late-night reading and the faint, clean smell of the previous night's rain. She dressed with the same methodical care she applied to everything. She chose a pair of well-fitting grey trousers, a simple cream-colored silk blouse, and sturdy, polished boots. Over it, she wore her new traveling cloak of dark, heavy wool. Her honey blonde hair was brushed until it shone and tied back in a simple, elegant braid that fell to the small of her back. The style was practical, yet it accentuated the graceful line of her neck and the ethereal quality of her features. She was the picture of serene, self-possessed maturity. When she descended the stairs, her trunk magically lightened by a subtle charm she'd woven herself after reading about the concept in the standard book of spells. Gliding smoothly behind her, Mrs. Gable was waiting. The matron's eyes were misty. In her hands, she held a small, slightly lopsided paper bag. I packed you some sandwiches, Mrs. Gable said, her voice thick with emotion. And a jam tart. For the journey. Ariana, who rarely showed overt emotion, felt a genuine warmth spread through her chest. In her own way, this kind woman had been her guardian, the anchor to her new, small life before the wider magical world had come calling. She accepted the bag with a soft, grateful smile that made the matron's own smile wobble. Thank you, Mrs. Gable. For everything. Oh, you be good, dear, the matron whispered, pulling her into a brief, heartfelt hug. You are a special girl, Ariana. Don't let anyone ever tell you otherwise. A taxi, arranged by a discreet missive from Hogwarts, was waiting to take her to King's Cross Station. The journey through London was a transition, a final farewell to the mundane world of red buses and bustling pedestrians. Ariana watched the familiar sights pass by, feeling not sadness, but a calm sense of closure. That world, the one of her past life and her brief time at the orphanage, was now officially behind her. Everything ahead was new territory, a landscape she knew only from a map and was about to explore on foot for the very first time. King's Cross Station was an overwhelming cathedral of noise and motion. The air was thick with the smell of steam and steel, and the roar of announcements and the shuffling feet of 1,000 travelers echoed off the high, arched ceiling. People rushed everywhere, a river of humanity flowing towards their mundane destinations. Ariana, with her quiet poise and the small black cat peeking out from the opening of her cloak, was an island of stillness in the chaotic current. She consulted the ticket Hagrid had given her. Platform 9 3/4. Her eyes scanned the station's signs. Platform 9. Platform 10. There was, of course, no 9 3/4. She felt the corner of her lip twitch in a small, private smile. She knew the secret. She could feel it a shimmer in the air, a concentration of the anima mundi localized on the solid brick barrier between the two platforms. It was a masterpiece of concealment, a door that was only a door to those who knew it was there. As she made her way towards the barrier, her gaze swept the crowd, a habit born of an architect's observational nature. And then she saw him. Harry Potter was standing forlornly beside a pillar, looking lost and increasingly desperate. His trunk was piled on a trolley that seemed too large for him to manage, and perched atop it was the cage containing his magnificent snowy owl, who looked far more dignified than her owner. He kept looking from his ticket to the platform indicators, his face a mask of frantic confusion. The Dursleys, she noted with a flicker of cold anger, were nowhere in sight. They had abandoned him here, leaving an 11-year-old child who had never heard of magic to navigate this impossible puzzle on his own. It was a final, petty cruelty. His plight was drawing stares. People were beginning to notice the boy with the owl, muttering and pointing. His panic was escalating, his face flushing with embarrassment. Without a moment's hesitation, Ariana changed her course. She glided through the crowd, her own trunk following her like a loyal dog, and came to a stop beside him. "Lost?" she asked, her voice calm and even. Harry jumped, startled. He spun around, and his face flooded with relief when he saw her. In this overwhelming sea of strangers, she was a familiar, reassuring presence. "Ariana. I don't know where to go. The ticket says platform 9 3/4, but there isn't one." "No," she agreed smoothly, her gaze drifting to the brick barrier. "There isn't. Not one you can see, at least." She gestured with her head. "The entrance is that way. Through the barrier between platforms 9 and 10. Harry stared at her, then at the solid wall, his eyes wide with disbelief and a healthy dose of fear. "Through the... You're joking." "Do I look like I'm joking, Harry?" she asked, her expression serene. She could see a family of redheads further down the platform, clearly magical, but she decided this was a moment for her to take the lead, to solidify their burgeoning camaraderie. "It's magic. You just have to walk straight at it. It's best to get a bit of a run-up if you're nervous." She saw the flicker of doubt and terror in his eyes. He was envisioning a painful collision, public humiliation. He was a boy who had spent his life being the butt of the joke, the victim of cruel pranks. Trusting in the impossible was a huge leap of faith for him. "Watch me," she said. Without any further ceremony, she squared her shoulders, took a firm grip on the handle of her trunk, and began to walk. She didn't run. She walked with a steady, confident pace directly towards the solid brick wall. For a split second, the mundane world registered the impending impact: brick, bone, and splintered wood. Then she simply vanished. She passed through the barrier as if it were smoke. One moment she was in the noisy, grey expanse of King's Cross, the next she was standing on a sun-drenched platform, bathed in the warm light of a world she had only ever dreamed of. Platform 9 3/4 was alive. A magnificent, scarlet steam engine, the Hogwarts Express, was hissing proudly, billowing clouds of steam that drifted like morning fog over the heads of the crowd. The platform was thronged with witches and wizards in robes of every color, seeing their children off. Cats of all descriptions wound their way through legs, and the air was filled with the hooting of owls and the excited chatter of students greeting their friends after a long summer. The ambient magic was thick and joyful, a stark contrast to the utilitarian hum of the station on the other side. A moment later, Harry stumbled through the barrier, his eyes wide and wild, a look of pure, unadulterated shock on his face. He had closed his eyes and run, fully expecting to crash, and had instead found himself here. He stared at the scarlet engine, at the crowd, at Ariana standing there waiting for him, and a slow, brilliant smile spread across his face. It was the first truly happy, unguarded smile she had seen from him. "See," she said simply. "Magic." "Wicked," he breathed, the word a perfect summation of his awe. "We should find a compartment before they all fill up," Ariana suggested, already moving towards the train. "The trunks need to be loaded." They found a porter who, with a grunt of acknowledgement, took their trunks to be stowed away. Harry made sure Hedwig's cage was handled with care. Ariana kept Midnight nestled securely in her cloak, the small, warm weight a comforting presence. They boarded the train, the scent of steam and old velvet filling the narrow corridor. Most of the compartments were already occupied, filled with boisterous groups of older students. Near the back of the train, however, they found an empty one. It was small and cozy, with plush crimson seats and a large window that looked out onto the bustling platform. "This will do," Ariana said, sliding gracefully onto the seat by the window. She set Midnight down on the cushion beside her, where the cat immediately curled into a neat, black ball and appeared to go to sleep. Harry sat opposite her, still looking slightly dazed, as if he couldn't quite believe any of this was real. He kept glancing out the window at the families saying their goodbyes, mothers hugging their sons, fathers giving last-minute advice. A pang of something sharp and lonely crossed his face, and Ariana's protective instinct, which she was beginning to realize was surprisingly fierce where Harry was concerned, stirred within her. He was an orphan, just like her. But he had been raised in a house filled with hate, while she had been raised in one filled with quiet kindness. He had been told he was worthless, a freak. She had been told she was special, a girl with a beautiful name. Their starting points were worlds apart, even if their destinations were the same. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice soft. He started, as if pulled from a deep thought. "Yeah," he said, a little too quickly. "It's just, a lot." "It is," she agreed. "But it's our lot now." She used the word "our" deliberately, a small but significant act of solidarity. His expression softened, the lonely look in his eyes receding slightly. He wasn't entirely alone in this strange new world. The train whistle blew a long, shrill note. A final wave of parents surged forward on the platform, waving handkerchiefs. With a great lurch and a hiss of steam, the Hogwarts Express began to move. They slid away from the platform, the faces of the waving families blurring and then shrinking into the distance. The train picked up speed, rattling and swaying as it left the magical enclave of the station and plunged into the London suburbs. For a long while, they sat in a comfortable silence, watching the mundane world of terraced houses and grey cityscapes flash by the window. Ariana reached into the lopsided paper bag Mrs. Gable had given her. She pulled out a perfectly made corned beef sandwich wrapped in wax paper and offered it to Harry. "Hungry?" He looked surprised, then his stomach rumbled audibly, and he blushed. "Yeah, a bit," he admitted. He took the sandwich gratefully. "Thanks." As he ate, Ariana unwrapped a jam tart for herself. She took a small, neat bite, the familiar taste of final, sweet farewell to her life at St. Jude's. The train rattled on, carrying them north, away from everything they had ever known. Harry, munching on his sandwich, looked at the sleeping black cat beside Ariana. "Ollivander said your wand had to be custom-made," he said, the awe still evident in his voice. "With elder wood. What does that mean?" Ariana took a moment before answering, choosing her words with the care of a scholar. "Elder is a wood with a great deal of history, Harry. It's considered powerful, but also demanding. It aligns only with a witch or wizard of significant strength and will." She didn't mention the Deathly Hallows or the Elder Wand's bloody history. He had enough burdens for one day. And the Thunderbird core suggests a magical signature that is attuned to natural forces, to storms. "Ollivander believes my magic is elemental." Harry just stared at her, his half-eaten sandwich forgotten. "Elemental," he repeated, as if the word itself held immense power. Ariana simply nodded, her periwinkle eyes calm and deep. The journey had just begun, but already, the lines were being drawn. He was the boy who lived, a figure of prophecy and fate. And she was something else. Something new. A quiet force of nature, a weaver of storms, sitting calmly on a train hurtling towards a future she intended to build with her own two hands. Chapter 6, The Artifice of Kindness. The train rattled onward, a rhythmic percussion marking their steady progress away from the mundane world. The simple act of sharing food had created a comfortable intimacy in the compartment, a small pocket of peace amidst the train's underlying excitement. Harry, having finished his sandwich, was looking at Ariana with an open, unshielded curiosity. He was a boy starved not just for food, but for answers, for a sense of belonging, and she seemed to be a wellspring of both. "So, you never got your wand in Diagon Alley," he stated, less a question and more a confirmation of the strange events in Ollivander's. Did he send it to you?" A small, knowing smile touched Ariana's lips. He did, she confirmed. It arrived 2 days ago. By Al. An experience that caused Mrs. Gable to require a cup of very sweet tea and a long sit-down. The memory was a pleasant one. A magnificent horned owl, a species native to the Americas and clearly a favorite of Ollivanders for special deliveries, had arrived at her window with a long, slender package. The box was unremarkable, but it had been sealed with a complex knot and a drop of wax that she knew, instinctively, only her touch could melt. Inside, resting on a bed of deep violet velvet, was her wand. There was also a note, written in Ollivander's spidery script, "Miss Dumbledore, a wand of destiny for a hand that weaves it. It has accepted you. I trust you will know what to do with this as well." Tucked beside the wand had been the gift he mentioned, the holster. "Would you like to see it?" she asked Harry. His eyes lit up. "Yeah." Ariana shifted slightly on the plush seat. She extended her left arm, pushing back the sleeve of her blouse. At first, Harry saw nothing but her pale skin. But as she angled her wrist, the light caught the edge of something. It was a bangle, so thin and fine it was almost invisible, made of a silvery white metal that didn't seem to reflect light so much as absorb it. It was elegant, understated, and looked more like a delicate piece of jewelry than anything functional. "It's a gift from Mr. Ollivander," she explained. "For the unusual circumstances." Then, she performed a small, fluid motion, a deliberate and graceful flick of her wrist. It was not a violent snap, but an act of pure intentio. The silvery bangle glowed for a fraction of a second with a soft, internal light. From it, with a sound like a gentle sigh of wind, the wand shot into her waiting hand. It was not a crude, spring-loaded mechanism, it was a pure, silent act of magic, the wand flowing from its housing into her grasp as if it were a natural extension of her arm. She held it for Harry to see. It was beautiful, but in a severe, powerful way. It was 13 inches long, perfectly straight, and fashioned from a single, seamless piece of elder wood. The wood was not black, but a deep, complex grey-brown, the color of ancient driftwood polished by a storm-tossed sea. The grain was subtle, almost imperceptible, and the entire wand seemed to hum with a quiet, contained energy. There were no adornments, no carvings, no handle, just the stark, elegant simplicity of the wood itself. As she held it, Harry caught a faint, clean scent in the air, like the ozone-rich atmosphere just after a lightning strike. The wand didn't feel like an object. It felt like a piece of a storm, tamed and bound into a physical form. "Wow," Harry breathed, his eyes fixed on it. It was so different from his own warm, holly wand. This one was formidable, ancient. Ariana gave the wand a small, familiar turn in her fingers. The balance was perfect. It felt not like a tool, but like a part of her own body, a focusing lens for the vast sea of magic within her. Her gaze then fell upon Harry, and her analytical mind, the part that always saw the flaws in a design, took over. She looked at the pathetic, taped-together glasses perched on his nose. A symbol of his neglect, a constant, irritating imperfection. "Hold still," she said, her voice soft. She lifted the elder wand. She didn't jab it at him or make a grand gesture. She held it with the steady, poised grace of a conductor holding a baton, ready to guide an orchestra. She focused her intentio, not on a spell word like reparo, but on the fundamental concept of wholeness. She pictured his glasses not as broken, but as they were meant to be, a perfect, unbroken circle of wire, 2 flawless lenses. A single thread of silver-white light, thin as a spider's silk, flowed from the tip of her wand and touched the bridge of his glasses. There was no flash, no bang. Instead, the 2 halves of the wire frame seemed to flow like warm honey, melding together seamlessly until the break was gone. The sticky tape, its purpose now obsolete, simply turned to a fine grey dust and vanished. Harry gasped, reaching up to touch his face. He carefully took the glasses off, holding them up to the light. They were perfect. More than perfect, the lenses were spotlessly clean, the frames gleamed as if brand new. He put them back on, and the world snapped into a clearer focus than he could ever remember. How did you do that?" he stammered, utterly bewildered. "The world prefers order to chaos," Ariana replied, the explanation coming from the philosophical texts she had devoured. "Sometimes, it just needs a little encouragement to remember its proper shape." Her gaze then traveled down from his mended glasses to his clothes. The oversized, faded shirt and the baggy jeans that pooled around his ankles. They were another form of brokenness, another manifestation of the neglect he had endured. They were a statement that he was an afterthought, a boy who didn't deserve things that were his own. A flicker of something cool and decisive passed through her eyes. Kindness could be an act of artifice. "That's not all that needs fixing," she murmured, more to herself than to him. She raised her wand again. This was a far more complex piece of weaving. It required 2 stages. First, resizing. She focused on the blueprint of Harry himself, his height, the width of his shoulders, the length of his arms. She then projected that blueprint onto the clothes, her intentio a command for the materia of the fabric to conform. The effect was subtle, but astonishing. The baggy fabric of Harry's shirt seemed to retract, the seams shifting and tightening. The shoulders pulled in to fit him perfectly. The sleeves shortened to the correct length at his wrists. His jeans did the same, the excess fabric around his ankles drawing up, the waist fitting snugly. It happened in a smooth, silent wave that passed over his entire body. He was no longer a boy drowning in his cousin's cast-offs. He was just Harry. A boy who fit in his own skin. He looked down at himself, his mouth agape. They fit. "That's the first step," Ariana said. "Now for the second." This wasn't just repair, this was creation. Or rather, recreation. She drew on the principles from the art of artifice. She wasn't going to turn his clothes into something gaudy or ostentatious. That wasn't her style, and it wouldn't suit him. She envisioned a new design, simple, classic, and dignified. Her focus sharpened. She held the image in her mind, the faded grey of his shirt deepening into a rich, dark charcoal. The thin, worn cotton thickening into a soft, high-quality knit. The shapeless collar refining itself into a neat, button-down. For the jeans, she envisioned the washed-out blue darkening to a deep indigo, the frayed cuffs becoming clean and sharp. The silver-white light from her wand flowed out again, this time enveloping him in a soft, shimmering aura. He felt a strange, tingling sensation all over his body, as if he were standing in a gentle, warm rain. The very threads of his clothes were being rewoven on some invisible, magical loom. The colors deepened, the textures changed, the worn patches smoothed over into flawless fabric. The shimmering light faded. Harry looked down again, and this time, he was speechless. He was wearing a handsome, dark charcoal jumper over a crisp collared shirt, and a pair of perfectly fitting, dark wash jeans. They looked and felt brand new, and they were a style he would never have dared to even imagine for himself. They made him look older, more confident. He scrambled to his feet and looked at his faint reflection in the dark glass of the window. He barely recognized himself. The skinny, forgotten boy was gone. In his place was a boy who looked like he belonged. He turned to Ariana, his brilliant green eyes shining with an emotion so profound he couldn't put a name to it. It was gratitude, but it was more than that. It was the shock of being seen, truly seen, for the first time in his life. I don't know what to say," he finally managed, his voice thick. "Say nothing," Ariana said, her expression as placid as ever. There was no pride in her face, no sense of showing off. It was the simple, profound satisfaction of an architect looking at a design that was now perfectly balanced. "It's better, that's all." With another flick of her wrist, the formidable elder wand dissolved back into the silvery bangle, vanishing from sight as if it had never been there. The act was so smooth, so final, it seemed to put a punctuation mark on the entire event. Harry sat back down, slowly, running a hand over the soft fabric of his new jumper. He felt a warmth spreading through him that had nothing to do with the wool. It was the warmth of a genuine, selfless act of kindness. Hagrid had bought him his owl, a wonderful, joyous gift. But Ariana had given him something else entirely. She had given him dignity. He looked at her, at the beautiful, calm girl with the brilliant eyes, and he knew, with an unshakable certainty, that he had just found his first true friend. Outside, the English countryside continued to rush by, a blur of green fields and grazing sheep, utterly oblivious to the quiet, profound acts of magic and friendship unfolding within the scarlet train hurtling towards the future. Chapter 7, The Interruption of Worlds. The new equilibrium in the compartment was a fragile, precious thing. It was a space defined by quiet awe and nascent friendship, a silent understanding that had been forged by an act of profound, transformative kindness. Harry, still subtly marveling at the feel of clothes that were actually his, was looking at Ariana with a new light in his eyes. She was not just a friend, she was an anchor. Ariana, for her part, had returned to her book, The Unifying Principles of Intent. Midnight, who had slept through the entire magical display with the profound indifference only a cat can muster, remained a perfect circle of black fur beside her. The compartment had become their sanctuary, a self-contained world moving through the larger one. But the sanctuary was not destined to last. The first interruption came with a hesitant rap on the compartment door, followed by it sliding open to reveal a tall, gangly boy with a shock of fiery red hair, a long nose, and a generous smattering of freckles across his face. He was clutching a fat, grey rat that appeared to be fast asleep. "Excuse me," the boy said, his voice laced with a hopeful uncertainty. "Do you mind? Everywhere else is full." Harry, still buoyed by his recent transformation and eager to engage with this new magical world, looked at Ariana for a cue. Ariana's eyes flickered up from her book, her gaze sweeping over the newcomer in a single, comprehensive assessment. Ron Weasley. The sixth son of a pure-blood but financially struggling family. Fiercely loyal, but also insecure, prone to jealousy, and possessed of what her former life's memories would describe as the tactical awareness of a teapot. He was a good heart wrapped in a layer of immaturity. She saw a boy, not a future best friend for a prophesied hero. And her current intellectual pursuit was far more engaging than small talk with a stranger. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod of assent, a gesture that conveyed permission without welcome, and immediately dropped her eyes back to her page. The message was clear: you may exist in this space, but do not expect me to entertain you. Ron, however, directed his attention to the more approachable of the two. "I'm Ron, by the way. Ron Weasley." "I'm Harry Potter," Harry said, and a flicker of something was it triumph, crossed Ron's face. He had stumbled into the compartment of the celebrity. So it's true." Ron blurted out, his eyes wide. "I mean, do you really have the what?" Harry asked, though he knew perfectly well what was coming. "The scar," Ron whispered, leaning forward conspiratorially. Harry sighed, a gesture of someone already growing weary of his own legend, and lifted his fringe. Ron stared at the faint, lightning-bolt scar as if it were the crown jewels. This was the Harry he had heard about in stories, the boy who lived. He didn't seem to notice the well-made clothes or the newfound confidence in Harry's posture. He saw the myth. The conversation that followed was an awkward, boyish affair. Ron unwrapped a lumpy-looking sandwich and complained about his mother, pulled out his slightly worn-out wand, and tried, with disastrous results, to turn his rat, Scabbers, yellow. The spell produced a puff of green smoke and a foul smell, but the rat remained resolutely grey and asleep. Through it all, Ariana did not look up. The sound of their chatter was a low, buzzing distraction, like a fly against a windowpane. She simply tuned it out, her mind absorbed in a chapter discussing the metaphysical implications of using intentio to influence sentient minds. To her, the boys' conversation was mundane, predictable. It was the white noise of a world she was rapidly intellectually transcending. Their little gathering was interrupted a second time not by a knock, but by the compartment door sliding open with an arrogant swagger. In the doorway stood the pale, pointy-faced boy from Madame Malkin's, flanked by two boys who were built like miniature trolls and looked about as intelligent. Draco Malfoy, with Crabbe and Goyle in tow. Malfoy's grey eyes swept the compartment. He sneered at Ron's hand-me-down robes and the sad-looking sandwich. His gaze lingered on Harry's new, stylish clothes with a flicker of confusion, then landed on Ariana. His sneer faltered. She hadn't moved. She was still engrossed in her book, her magnificent panther in disguise asleep beside her, a picture of such serene, untouchable elegance that it seemed to rebuke his very presence. Well, Malfoy drawled, recovering his bravado. They were saying all the way up the train that Harry Potter was in this compartment. So it's you, is it? Yes, Harry said, his voice tight. He was on his feet now, standing beside Ron, a united front against the intruder. And you, Malfoy said, his gaze shifting to Ron. Red hair, and a hand-me-down robe, you must be a Weasley. He spat the name like an insult. He then turned his attention fully back to Harry, ignoring Ron as if he were a piece of furniture. You'll soon find out some wizarding families are much better than others, Potter. You don't want to go making friends with the wrong sort. I can help you there. He extended a pale hand, an offer of alliance. Harry stared at it, his expression hardening. I think I can tell who the wrong sort are for myself, thanks, he said coolly. Malfoy's face flushed an ugly pink. His attempt at securing the prize, the friendship of the upper hand. He noticed the candy Harry and Ron had bought from the trolley witch, a small mountain of chocolate frogs and Bertie Bott's every flavor beans. I'd be careful if I were you, Potter, he sneered. Unless you're a bit whiter than you look, you'll be joining him, he jerked his head towards Ron, in the Weasley family robes. At that moment, as if summoned by the rising tension, the door slid open for a third time. A girl stood there, already dressed in her new Hogwarts robes. She had a bossy, know-it-all air, bushy brown hair, and rather large front teeth. Hermione Granger. The future brightest witch of her age. But right now, she was just an insecure, slightly overwhelming girl desperate to prove herself. Has anyone seen a toad? She asked, her voice slightly shrill. A boy named Neville's lost one. Her eyes took in the scene, Malfoy and his goons squared off against Harry and Ron. Her gaze, however, was immediately drawn to the still, silent figure in the corner. She saw Ariana, her posture perfect, her face a mask of sublime concentration as she read a thick, unadorned book. Her mind, already cataloguing everything, registered the girl's ethereal beauty, the unusual quietness, and the title of the book, which looked far too advanced for a first year. Oh, are you doing magic? She said, spotting Ron's worn-out wand still in his hand. Let's see, then. Ron, flustered, was about to try his failed spell again, but Hermione cut him off, launching into a lecture about how she'd tried a few simple spells herself and they'd all worked for her. In a matter of seconds, she had established her intellectual superiority, leaving Ron looking both irritated and impressed. Her gaze then fell on Harry. Holy cricket, you're Harry Potter, she exclaimed, her bossy demeanor momentarily forgotten. She then launched into a rapid-fire recitation of all the books she'd read that mentioned him. It was during this speech that Ariana finally moved. Not because of the noise or the drama, but because she had finished her chapter. She marked her page with a thin slip of silk, closed the heavy tome with a soft, definitive thud, and looked up. Her luminous periwinkle eyes, holding the calm of centuries, swept over the tableau. She saw Ron's resentful awe, Malfoy's frustrated arrogance, and Hermione's desperate, information-fueled attempt to connect. They were children, playing out their pre-written roles, jockeying for position in a social hierarchy that had not yet even been formed. She felt a profound, intellectual disinterest in the entire drama. It was like watching ants scuttling over a dropped sweet. Her gaze met Hermione's. For a moment, she saw a flicker of something she recognized, a thirst for knowledge, a desire to understand the world through a framework of rules and facts. It was a familiar hunger, though Hermione's approach was to consume information, while Ariana's was to deconstruct it. There was potential there. A mild spark of interest. But it was overshadowed by the girl's current lack of social grace and her grating need for validation. The Hermione of the future, tempered by friendship and real-world peril, would be a formidable intellect and a loyal friend. This version was simply exhausting. Malfoy, seeing he had lost the attention of the room, decided to make a final, thuggish play. He made a grab for the sweets on the seat. But before his hand could touch a single chocolate frog, something moved with impossible speed. Midnight, who had appeared to be a dead-asleep ball of fur, uncoiled. She didn't growl or hiss. She simply moved, a blur of pure black that shot from the seat to the floor, positioning herself directly between Malfoy and the sweets. She sat there, perfectly still, and looked up at him. Her violet eyes, now glowing with a cold, intelligent light, held a clear and unambiguous warning. It was not the look of an animal. It was the look of a sentient being expressing its profound displeasure. Malfoy froze, his hand hovering in mid-air. Crabbe and Goyle, who had been snickering dumbly, fell silent. There was something deeply unsettling about the little cat, something that made the hair on their arms stand up. "I suggest you leave," Ariana said. Her voice was not loud. It was quiet, melodic, and utterly devoid of emotion. But it cut through the chatter and tension in the compartment like a shard of ice. It held an authority that was absolute. It was not a request. It was a statement of fact. "You will leave." Malfoy stared at her, then at the unnerving cat, and then back at her. He saw no anger, no fear, no engagement at all in her beautiful, placid face. He saw only a vast, serene dismissal. He, Draco Malfoy, scion of a powerful and wealthy pure-blood family, was being dismissed as one might dismiss a fly. It was more insulting than any shout or hex. He flushed an even deeper shade of red, mumbled something about filthy blood traitors and mudbloods, and practically fled the compartment, his two hulking bodyguards stumbling after him. The tension in the room popped like a pricked balloon. Ron let out a shaky breath. Harry just stared, impressed. Hermione, however, was intrigued. That was an interesting application of nonverbal social pressure, she observed, her analytical mind kicking into gear. "And your cat is very protective. Is it a particular breed?" "She is unique," Ariana replied, her voice giving nothing away. She reached down and stroked Midnight behind the ears. The cat instantly relaxed, the cold light in her eyes fading, and she leaped silently back onto the seat, curling up once more. Hermione seemed about to launch into a dozen more questions, but the moment was lost. "Well," she said, remembering her original purpose, "I'd best go look for Neville's toad. You two had better change into your robes. I expect we'll be arriving soon." She gave Ron a slightly disapproving look, then bustled out of the compartment, her head full of new data points to analyze. The compartment was quiet again. Ron looked at Ariana with a new respect. Harry just looked grateful. "Thanks," Harry said. He was an inconvenience, Ariana stated simply, reopening her book. "His presence was disrupting my reading." The message, though she may not have intended it, was clear to Harry. She hadn't defended him or Ron out of some sense of schoolyard loyalty. She had acted because Malfoy was an unwelcome variable in her controlled environment. And in that moment, Harry understood something fundamental about her. Her world was built on a foundation of order, logic, and quiet contemplation. And she would, with serene and absolute finality, remove anyone or anything that threatened to disturb it. Chapter 8, The Choice and the Phoenix. The train slowed, its rhythmic clatter giving way to a long, grinding squeal as it finally pulled into Hogsmeade Station. Night had fallen, and the platform was dark and windswept, lit only by the swinging lantern of a familiar, colossal figure. Furs years. Furs years over here. Hagrid's booming voice cut through the excited babble of the students pouring onto the platform. Come in, follow me. Any more furs years? Mind your step, now. Ariana, Harry, and Ron joined the nervous cluster of first-year students, a small flotilla of bobbing heads in a sea of older, more confident students. As they stumbled down a steep, narrow path, Ariana felt the ambient magic of the place wash over her. It was different from Diagon Alley's chaotic commercial hum or her own internal placid sea. This magic was ancient, layered, and deeply institutional. It was the magic of 1,000 years of learning, of powerful enchantments woven into the very stone and soil. It felt like walking into a library so vast and old that the air itself was saturated with knowledge. The path opened up suddenly, and a collective gasp went through the group of first years. Across the surface of a great, black lake, its water as smooth as polished obsidian, stood Hogwarts. It was a breathtaking sight, a sprawling castle of towering turrets and soaring spires, its multitude of windows glittering like stars against the dark, mountainous backdrop. It was grander, more real, and magnificent, than any illustration or cinematic depiction from her former life could have ever captured. For the first time, a genuine, unadulterated sense of wonder touched Ariana's composed features. This was a place of true magic, a testament to the power of artifice and will on a grand scale. No more N4 to a boat. Hagrid called, pointing to a fleet of small, dark boats bobbing gently by the shore, each with a lantern hanging from its prow. Ariana, Harry, and Ron found a boat and were soon joined by Hermione Granger, who was still chattering about the castle's history and magical protections. As the little fleet pushed off from the shore, moving silently across the black water, Ariana trailed her fingers in the cool lake. She could feel the life within it, the lazy drift of the Grindylows in the deep, the nascent consciousness of the giant squid, all part of the castle's vast, interconnected magical ecosystem. The view of the castle grew more imposing as they approached the cliff it was built upon. They passed through a curtain of ivy that hid a wide opening, disembarking in a dark, underground harbour that smelled of damp rock and lake water. Hagrid led them up a flight of stone steps and to a halt before a pair of massive, oak front doors. He raised a giant fist and knocked 3 times. The doors swung open to reveal Professor McGonagall. Her severe expression was just as Ariana remembered, but her eyes, as they swept over the nervous faces of the new students, held a flicker of something akin to pride. She led them into the magnificent entrance hall, its stone walls lit with flaming torches, the ceiling so high it was lost in shadow. The murmur of hundreds of voices from a doorway to the right indicated the rest of the school was already waiting. They were led into a small, empty chamber off the hall. Professor McGonagall gave them a stern introductory speech about the 4 houses: Gryffindor, Hufflepuff, Ravenclaw, and Slytherin, and the importance of the House Cup, her words instilling a mixture of excitement and terror in the assembled children. As she left to check if everything was ready, a wave of panicked whispers broke out. "How exactly do they sort?" Harry asked Ron nervously. "Some sort of test, I think," Ron said, his face pale. "Fred said it hurts a lot, but I think he was joking." Hermione, meanwhile, was muttering all the spells she knew under her breath, a mantra against her own anxiety. Ariana alone remained silent, her posture relaxed, her periwinkle eyes calm. She knew about the sorting hat. The concept of having her mind read was not daunting, her own thoughts were a carefully ordered library, and she was a very particular librarian. When Professor McGonagall returned and led them into the Great Hall, the sight silenced even the most panicked whispers. It was even more spectacular from the inside. Thousands of candles floated in midair over 4 long tables, where the rest of the students were seated. The ceiling, as Hermione had read, was bewitched to look like the night sky outside, a vast, star-dusted velvet canopy. At the front of the hall, on a raised dais, sat the staff. And in the center, in a large, golden chair, sat Albus Dumbledore. His long silver hair and beard seemed to catch the candlelight, and his half-moon spectacles were perched on his long, crooked nose. His blue eyes, magnified by the lenses, twinkled with a benign amusement as he watched the new students approach. His gaze passed over the familiar face of Harry Potter, then continued its sweep. And then it stopped. It stopped on Ariana. The twinkling in his eyes vanished, replaced by a profound, breathtaking stillness. It was a look of utter, soul-shaking shock, a look that stripped away the centuries of wisdom and power, leaving only the raw emotion of an old man seeing a ghost. He saw his sister's face, not as a vague family resemblance, but as a perfect, living resurrection. Her youth, her beauty, her luminous eyes, it was Ariana as he remembered her from that last, golden summer before tragedy struck. His hands, which had been resting on the arms of his chair, gripped the wood so tightly his knuckles turned white. Professor McGonagall had warned him, but words were a pale, inadequate preparation for this visceral reality. Ariana met his gaze from across the hall. She did not flinch, nor did she offer a challenging stare. She simply held his gaze with her own calm, periwinkle one, acknowledging his shock with a serene poise that was, in itself, deeply unsettling. It was the face of his sister, but the soul behind the eyes was something else entirely. A calm and mature look. Professor McGonagall placed a 4-legged stool before the first years, and on top of it, a patched, frayed, and exceedingly dirty wizard's hat. A rip near the brim opened wide like a mouth, and the sorting hat began to sing its annual song. When it was finished, the sorting began. One by one, students were called up. Hermione Granger, after a moment's deliberation, was sent to Gryffindor. Draco Malfoy was barely touched by the hat before it screamed Slytherin. Ron Weasley, looking terrified, was also sorted into Gryffindor, to the loud cheers of his older brothers. Harry was sorted a moment later, the hat barely hesitating before yelling Gryffindor, and the resulting cheer was the loudest of the night. The Weasley twins were chanting, "We got Potter! We got Potter!" Then, Professor McGonagall called out, "Dumbledore, Ariana!" A hush fell over the great hall. The name alone was enough to cause a stir, a murmur that rippled through the student body and even along the staff table. The students craned their necks to see the girl who bore the headmaster's famous name. They saw a vision of ethereal beauty and unsettling calm walking gracefully towards the stool. She sat down, and Professor McGonagall placed the dusty hat on her head. It slipped down over her eyes, plunging her into darkness. "Well now," a small, dusty voice spoke inside her head. "This is something I have not seen in a very long time." "A mind so ordered. It is not the busy, fact-filled mind of a Ravenclaw, nor the simply ambitious, cunning mind of a Slytherin. It is a quiet mind. A deep mind. Like a library in a forgotten palace." Ariana did not respond, she simply allowed the hat to browse. "There is immense power here," the hat continued, its voice full of a strange respect. "A controlled power, unlike the normal first-year children. Woven into the very fabric of your being. And behind it all, another soul. Another life. Ah, and a traveler. How very, very interesting. You possess knowledge that could place you at the top of any house. The cunning to be a great Slytherin. The intellect for a premier Ravenclaw. You have a loyalty that Hufflepuff would treasure, and a quiet courage that is the bedrock of Gryffindor." The hat was silent for a long moment, longer than for any other student. The entire hall watched, holding its breath. "You do not fit, Miss Dumbledore," the hat finally concluded. "You do not fit into any of my neat little boxes. You are a category unto yourself. A mind like yours does not need my guidance. It needs only to choose its own path. So, I will do something I have only ever done a handful of times in my long existence. I will ask. Where do you wish to be? Ariana considered. Ravenclaw was tempting, the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake was a noble one. But she did not need a common room to study. Slytherin held a certain appeal in its pragmatism, but she had no interest in the petty ambitions of most of its members. Hufflepuff's loyalty was admirable, but she was not a joiner. That left Gryffindor. The house of the brave, yes, but also the house of the proactive. The house of those who acted on their convictions. More importantly, it was Harry's house. He was the fulcrum upon which this world's future balanced, and proximity to him was a strategic necessity. He was also her friend, and he would need allies who were not blinded by his legend. Gryffindor, she projected, her mental voice calm and decisive. Gryffindor? The hat sounded surprised. The house of the loud, the bold, the reckless? It is an odd choice for one so serene. But a choice made is a choice respected. Very well. To the hall, the hat shouted, Gryffindor. A thunderous applause erupted from the Gryffindor table. Ariana gracefully removed the hat, handed it to Professor McGonagall, and walked towards her new house. She took a seat opposite Harry, next to Hermione, who immediately began asking her what the hat had said to take so long. Ariana simply smiled and said, it was being thorough. Once the feast was over and the students were being led away by their prefects, Professor McGonagall approached Ariana. Miss Dumbledore, she said, her voice low. The headmaster would like a word with you in his office. Please, follow me. She was led not to the chaotic dormitories, but up a silent, moving spiral staircase, to a door guarded by a large stone gargoyle. Professor McGonagall uttered the password sherbet lemon and the gargoyle sprang to life, revealing the entrance. Dumbledore's office was a vast, circular room filled with strange, silvery instruments that whirred and puffed smoke. Bookshelves were crammed with ancient tomes, and on a perch near the desk, a magnificent, crimson bird with a golden tail regarded her with intelligent, black eyes. Albus Dumbledore was standing by the window, looking out at the dark grounds. He turned as she entered, and the professional mask of the headmaster was gone. In its place was the raw vulnerability she had seen in the Great Hall. His blue eyes were filled with a century of sorrow, regret, and a desperate, hopeful curiosity. Ariana, he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. My dear child. Forgive an old man's shock. You are, the very image of her. I have been told, Ariana replied, her voice soft. He gestured to a chair opposite his desk. Please. Sit. He settled into his own large chair, his long fingers steepled before him. He seemed to be struggling for words. Your parents, they were from my nephew Credence's line, a squib branch of the family. I confess I did not keep as close a track of those branches as I ought to have. A failing of mine, among many. His eyes searched her face, looking for any sign of the trauma, the fragility, the tormented spirit of the girl he had lost. He found none. He found only a preternatural calm, a self-possession that was both baffling and, in a way, a profound relief. You seem very well adjusted, my dear, he finally managed. Professor McGonagall told me of your unusual control of your magic. Ollivander, too, sent me a most effusive owl regarding your wand. At that moment, the crimson bird on the perch let out a low, beautiful, trilling note. It unfurled its magnificent wings and flew from its perch, not to Dumbledore, but to Ariana. It landed softly on her outstretched arm, its golden claws gentle on the fabric of her sleeve. It was Fawkes, the phoenix. Dumbledore watched, his breath catching in his throat. Fawkes was a creature of immense discernment, attuned to loyalty, love, and the purity of a soul. He was not a creature to offer his affection lightly. Yet here he was, nuzzling his beautiful head against Ariana's cheek, letting out a series of soft, contented croons. Ariana, in turn, stroked his warm, crimson feathers, her touch gentle and sure. A silent communion was passing between the girl and the immortal bird. The sight seemed to solidify something in Dumbledore's mind. A great, painful weight settled in his heart, followed by a fierce, protective resolve. He had plans for Harry Potter. Difficult, dangerous plans that were necessary for the salvation of their world. He had steeled himself to manipulate, to guide, to sacrifice the boy if need be, for the greater good. But this girl, this child who wore his sister's face, who calmed his phoenix with a simple touch, who looked at him with eyes that held no fear and no judgment, he could not do it to her. He could not, would not, draw her into his webs of intrigue and sacrifice. The thought of using her, of putting her in harm's way, was a sacrilege he could not commit. It would be like losing his sister all over again, but this time, through his own deliberate actions. The greater good could demand the soul of Harry Potter. But it would not have hers. He would protect her, even from himself. He would keep her separate, allow her to flourish, to study, to live the peaceful, powerful life that the first Ariana had been denied. It was a penance he would offer to the ghost of his sister. "You have a remarkable gift, Ariana," he said, his voice finding its strength again, now infused with this new, quiet conviction. "Hogwarts is here to help you cultivate it. If you ever need anything, a book from the restricted section, guidance on a particular branch of magic, or simply someone to talk to, my door is always open to you." It was an unprecedented offer. An open invitation to the headmaster's knowledge and resources, with no strings attached. "Thank you, headmaster," Ariana said, her fingers still stroking the phoenix's warm crest. "I appreciate that." As she finally left his office, Fox flying reluctantly back to his perch, Dumbledore sank back into his chair, feeling the weight of 100 years. He looked at the portrait of the laughing, happy girl on his wall, the original Ariana. He had failed her. He would not fail this one. His grand, intricate plans for the coming war with Voldemort had just developed a new, inviolable rule: Ariana Dumbledore was to be kept out of it at all costs. Chapter 9, The Grammar of Magic. The first few days at Hogwarts were a whirlwind of new corridors, shifting staircases, and the bewildering but exciting rhythm of a life governed by bells and timetables. For most first years, it was an exhilarating chaos. For Ariana, it was an exercise in observation, a study of the intricate systems both magical and social that made the castle function. She moved through the boisterous, crowded hallways of Gryffindor Tower like a swan on a choppy lake, serene and undisturbed by the frantic paddling of those around her. Her mornings began not with a jolt, but with a slow, quiet awakening. Midnight, in her small cat form, would be a warm, dark weight on her chest, her strange, resonant purr a more effective and gentle alarm clock than any spell. She would watch the other girls in her dormitory, Hermione, Lavender Brown, and Parvati Paddle, rush through their morning routines with a flurry of chatter and misplaced hair ribbons. Ariana's own preparations were a silent, efficient ballet. She dressed, braided her hair, and ensured her school bag was perfectly ordered, all with a placid economy of motion that was both admirable and slightly unnerving to her dorm mates. Their first class was Transfiguration, taught by their own head of house. Professor McGonagall's classroom was exactly as Ariana had imagined it would be, a large, sunlit room with high windows, orderly rows of desks, and an air of serious, intellectual rigor. McGonagall herself stood at the front, her posture as severe and unyielding as the stone walls, an aura of no-nonsense authority radiating from her. "Transfiguration is some of the most complex and dangerous magic you will learn at Hogwarts," she began, her sharp gaze sweeping over the class, making every student sit up a little straighter. "Anyone messing around in my class will leave and not come back. You have been warned." She then transformed her desk into a large, grunting pig and back again, a feat of such flawless, casual power that it left the entire class speechless. The task for their first lesson was, by comparison, deceptively simple: to turn a matchstick into a needle. Each student was given a single wooden matchstick. A collective sigh of relief went through the room. It seemed manageable. But as the students began, wands waving and brows furrowed in concentration, the true difficulty became apparent. Ron Weasley's matchstick shuddered, turned a silvery grey, but remained resolutely blunt and wooden. Seamus Finnegan managed to create a small, fiery spark that singed his eyebrows. Neville Longbottom's match simply trembled pathetically on his desk. Hermione, naturally, was the first to achieve a semblance of success. She had clearly memorized the incantation and the required wand movement perfectly. With a crisp flick and a clear declaration of the spell, her matchstick turned into a needle. It was sharp, it was silver, but it was slightly bent, and still retained a faint, woody texture. McGonagall awarded her a rare, approving nod. Ariana watched all of this with a calm, analytical eye. She saw her classmates treating the spell like a recipe: follow the steps and hope for the correct result. They were trying to impose their will on the matchstick, to force it into a new shape. She knew, from her own studies, that this was an inefficient and crude approach. One did not command the anima mundi, one guided it. She picked up her matchstick, holding it lightly in her fingers. She did not immediately reach for her wand. First, she closed her eyes and focused her intentio. In her mind, the architect's mind, she did not just picture a needle. She constructed a perfect blueprint. She envisioned a needle of flawless steel, 38 mm in length, with a perfectly tapered point measuring a precise 12 degrees. She designed an exquisitely sharp tip, a smooth, polished shaft, and an eyelet that was clean and free of burrs. And for her own private satisfaction, she added a final, tiny detail to the blueprint: an almost microscopic, elegant spiral pattern engraved around the head, a design so fine it would be nearly invisible to the naked eye. Once the blueprint in her mind was absolute, a perfect, unwavering Platonic form of the needle, she opened her eyes. She took up her Elder Wand, its cool, storm-charged wood a familiar comfort in her hand. She aimed it at the matchstick. She did not say the incantation aloud. She simply held the word, the concept, within her mind and used it as a key to open the flow of magic. She then gently pushed her perfect mental blueprint into the materia of the matchstick, using the anima mundi as her medium. There was no flash, no sound. The change was instantaneous and absolute. One moment, a wooden matchstick lay on the desk. The next, a perfect, gleaming steel needle lay in its place. It shone under the classroom light, a tiny monument to flawless design. Professor McGonagall, who had been making her rounds and offering sharp critiques, stopped dead at Ariana's desk. Her thin lips parted slightly as she stared at the needle. The other students were still struggling to produce anything remotely sharp. Here was not just a needle, but the archetypal ideal of a needle. She leaned in closer, her keen eyes narrowing. She noticed it then: the impossibly fine, spiraling pattern at the needle's head. It was a detail that was not part of the lesson. It was an embellishment, an act of such superfluous, exquisite control that it bordered on the impossible for a first-year student. It was not just a successful transfiguration, it was an act of artistry. She looked from the needle to Ariana's serene face. The girl's periwinkle eyes met hers, calm and questioning. There was no pride in her expression, no look of triumph. Only the quiet satisfaction of a task correctly completed. 5 points to Gryffindor, McGonagall said, her voice betraying none of her inner shock. But as she walked away, she couldn't stop herself from glancing back one more time. The girl was not just a prodigy. She was something else entirely. Their charms lesson with the diminutive Professor Flitwick was a far more cheerful affair. The tiny professor, who had to stand on a pile of books to see over his desk, was excitable and full of praise. Their first lesson was the wand lighting charm, Lumos. Again, the results were mixed. Most students produced a weak, sputtering light at the tip of their wands. Ron's looked like a dying firefly. Harry managed a respectable, if slightly flickering, white light. Hermione, with her precise pronunciation, produced a bright, steady beam that earned her a delighted squeak from Flitwick and another 10 points for Gryffindor. When it was Ariana's turn, she once again approached the task from a foundation of pure theory. Light, she knew, was not a monolith. It was a spectrum. It had wavelength, frequency, intensity. To simply create light was like a painter choosing only to use the color white. She held her wand and focused her intentio. She didn't just think light. She thought of a gentle, swirling dance of colors. She envisioned threads of soft rose pink, tranquil lavender, and warm gold, all weaving together in a slow, harmonious ballet. She channeled her magic, not as a single blast, but as 3 distinct, controlled streams, each imbued with a different chromatic property. Lumos, she whispered, the word more a breath than a command. The light that bloomed at the tip of her elder wand was breathtaking. It was not a single beam. It was a soft, glowing sphere of intertwined colors. Rose, lavender, and gold swirled within it like mist, coalescing and separating in a gentle, mesmerizing dance. It cast a warm, beautiful light across her desk, making the very air around her seem magical. The classroom fell silent. Everyone stared, mouths agape, at the beautiful, impossible light. Professor Flitwick, standing on his pile of books, let out an audible gasp, his tiny hands clasped together in pure delight. "Oh, my stars," he chirped, his voice full of wonder. "Extraordinary! Miss Dumbledore, that is the most advanced and controlled first-year lumos I have ever seen in my 50 years of teaching. That is not just a charm, that is a work of art." 20 points to Gryffindor. 20 points. Ariana simply gave a small, polite nod of acknowledgement and, with the thought, extinguished the beautiful, swirling light, leaving her classmates staring at her with a mixture of awe and utter bewilderment. The final class of the day was the one everyone had been dreading, potions, in the dungeons, with Professor Snape. The descent into the dungeons was a descent into cold and shadow. The classroom was dark, lined with shelves of pickled animals and mysterious ingredients in glass jars. The air was frigid, and the students shivered in their robes. Professor Snape made his entrance like a phantom, his black robes billowing behind him. He was a man who commanded fear as effortlessly as other wizards commanded magic. His opening speech was a masterpiece of intimidation. He spoke of the subtle science and exact art of potion making, his voice a low, menacing whisper that held the class in a grip of terror. He made it clear he expected little from them, a cauldron full of dunderheads. Then, his black, merciless eyes landed on Harry. He began a brutal interrogation, asking Harry questions about powders and bezoars that a first year could not possibly know. It was a naked display of power, a targeted humiliation. When Harry inevitably failed to answer, Snape sneered. "Pity. Clearly, fame isn't everything." He ignored Hermione's frantically waving hand completely. The day's lesson was to brew a simple cure for boils. The instructions were on the blackboard. Snape stalked the aisles like a predator, his robes whispering over the cold stone floor, criticizing Neville's potion until the boy was a trembling mess and his cauldron was melting, and sneering at Harry and Ron's clumsy attempts. He approached Ariana's desk last. She had set up her station with the neat, methodical precision of a surgeon. Her ingredients were chopped to a perfect, uniform size. Her cauldron was simmering at a precise, steady temperature. She had read the instructions, yes, but she was also feeling the potion. She could sense the magical properties of the dried nettles releasing into the water, the way the stewed horned slugs created a viscous base, and understood on an intuitive level that the porcupine quills must be added after the cauldron was taken off the fire, to prevent their volatile magic from causing a reaction. Snape loomed over her, his shadow falling across her workbench. He peered into her cauldron, his long, hooked nose nearly dipping into the steam. He was searching, hunting for a flaw, for any minuscule error he could use to tear down this new, prodigal Dumbledore. He had been warned by the headmaster, in no uncertain terms, that this particular student was not to be targeted. The command had been delivered with a quiet, steely finality that even Snape had not dared to question. But the prohibition only fueled his resentment. He wanted to find a reason, any reason, to justify his inherent disdain. He found nothing. The potion in her cauldron was perfect. It was the exact shade of turquoise the textbook described. It was simmering with a gentle, even heat. The consistency was flawless. He could smell the perfect balance of the ingredients. It was the work not of a first-year student, but of an accomplished Podiwunner. His black eyes narrowed. He looked at her calm, focused expression, the graceful way she stirred the potion 7 times, clockwise, each rotation a perfect circle. He saw no fear, no anxiety. She was not even looking at him. Her entire being was focused on the art she was creating in her cauldron. He was filled with a cold, grudging fury. He could not fault her. He could not belittle her. He was bound by the headmaster's strange, protective order. So he did the only thing he could. He said nothing. He stared at her perfect potion for a long, tense moment, the silence stretching until the other students held their breath. Then, with a faint sneer that was more for himself than for her, he turned on his heel and swept away to terrorize someone else. Ariana had been aware of his presence, of course. She had felt the weight of his gaze, the sharp, analytical probe of his own powerful magic assessing her work. She felt his frustration, his resentment, and his grudging respect. And she understood. He was a man of immense talent and deep bitterness, bound by an order he despised. His pointed silence was more telling than any praise could ever be. It was a declaration of her victory in their silent, one-sided battle. When the class was over and she had bottled a sample of her flawless potion, she left the dungeons, her composure as serene as ever. The first day was over. She had met the challenges laid before her and found them simple. The true curriculum, she knew, was not in these classrooms. It was in the ancient books, in the deep theory, and in the quiet of her own mind, where the real magic was waiting to be woven. Chapter 10, The Calm of the Open Sky. The promise of a first flying lesson sent a ripple of pure, unadulterated excitement through the Gryffindor common room. For days, it was all anyone could talk about. Boys boasted of their supposed prowess on a broom, while girls chattered about the thrill of soaring through the air. It was a rite of passage, the first taste of true, exhilarating freedom that magic could offer. Ariana observed the fervor with a detached amusement. The concept of flying was interesting, certainly. From a theoretical standpoint, it was a fascinating application of magical levitation bound to a physical object, requiring a unique synergy between rider and broom. The idea of reckless speed and competitive sport, however, held absolutely no appeal to her. Quidditch, with its chaotic violence and tribal devotion, struck her as a fundamentally illogical expenditure of energy. She was interested in the experience of flight, not the performance of it. On the appointed afternoon, the Gryffindors trudged down the sloping lawns towards a flat, smooth patch of grass opposite the Forbidden Forest. The Slytherins were already there, a sullen, arrogant cluster, their new brooms gleaming. The school brooms provided for the lesson were a sorry sight, a collection of ancient, rickety shooting stars and clean sweeps with splintered handles and twigs sticking out at odd angles. The teacher, Madame Hooch, was a formidable witch with short, grey hair and sharp, hawk-like yellow eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She barked instructions with the crisp authority of a drill sergeant. "All right now, stand by your brooms," she commanded. "Stick your right hand out over it and say, 'Up.'" A chorus of "Up" s echoed across the lawn. Harry's broom leaped into his hand at once, as did Malfoy's. Ron's took a few tries before it reluctantly hopped up. Neville's didn't move at all. Ariana looked down at the battered old broom at her feet. It was a sad, neglected object. She didn't shout or command. Instead, she reached out with a sliver of her intentio, not forcing her will upon the broom, but rather inviting it. She projected a sense of partnership, of shared purpose. She didn't want to conquer it, she wanted to work with it. Up, she said, her voice quiet and clear. The broom rose from the grass as if lifted by an invisible, gentle hand and settled perfectly into her waiting grasp. It felt less like an act of summoning and more like a handshake. After a lecture on proper mounting and grip, Madame Hooch gave the command they had all been waiting for. On my whistle, 3, 2, 1. The piercing shriek of the whistle cut the air, and 20 brooms lifted off the ground. Most were wobbly and uncontrolled. Ron shot up like a cork from a bottle and immediately plummeted back down with a thud. But not everyone was so clumsy. Harry was a natural, soaring into the air with an ease and grace that spoke of an innate talent. Malfoy, too, was a skilled and confident flyer, smirking as he zipped past the flailing newbies. Ariana's ascent was different from both. She did not soar, nor did she wobble. She simply rose. With a gentle push of her will, the old broom lifted her 10 feet into the air, then 15, with the smooth, steady grace of a modern hydraulic lift. She hung there, suspended in the crisp autumn air, perfectly still. The sensation was sublime. She could feel the wind in her hair, the vast, open expanse of the sky above, and the sprawling grounds of Hogwarts laid out below like a living map. It was a perspective shift, a liberation from the horizontal plane of existence. She felt the magic of the broom not as a brute force to be wrestled with, but as a current to be ridden. She nudged it forward, and it glided smoothly through the air, her braid trailing behind her like a silken banner. She banked left, then right, her movements fluid and economical, a picture of absolute, serene control. She had no interest in speed or tricks, she was simply savoring the pure, quiet joy of being untethered from the earth. Madame Hooch's hawk-like eyes followed her for a moment, a flicker of surprised approval in their depths. The Dumbledore girl was as unusual in the air as she was on the ground. The lesson, however, was destined for chaos. Neville Longbottom, who had been nervous from the start, seemed to lose his nerve completely. His face was a mask of sheer terror. His broom, perhaps sensing his panic, gave a violent lurch. "Mr. Longbottom, get back down this instant!" Madame Hooch shouted. But Neville was no longer in control. The broom shot upwards, 20 feet, then 30. It began to buck and swerve wildly. Neville let out a terrified wail, his knuckles white as he clung on for dear life. The broom zigzagged through the air like a deranged hornet before it finally went into a steep dive. Neville slipped from the seat, his robes catching on a twig for a moment before he tumbled free, plummeting towards the hard ground below. A collective scream went up from the students. Hermione's hands flew to her mouth. Madame Hooch was already moving, but she wouldn't be fast enough. Ariana, who had been observing the situation with a calm, analytical eye, acted without hesitation. There was no time for a complex weaving of magic. This required a single, powerful, and instantaneous application of will. She pointed her elder wand, which she had, with characteristic foresight, already slipped from its holster down at the falling boy. She didn't shout the incantation. She pushed the concept, the pure, unadulterated meaning of it, from her mind through the wand. Arresto momentum. A visible shimmer, like a heat haze, pulsed out from her wand and enveloped Neville just as he was 10 feet from the ground. His rapid descent did not stop abruptly, which would have been just as damaging as the impact. Instead, his velocity was bled away in an instant. He went from plummeting to floating, his fall arrested so gently that he hung in the air for a second before drifting to the ground like a falling leaf. He landed in a crumpled, sobbing heap, but he was completely unharmed, save for a sprained wrist from his initial fall from the broom. The entire class stared, stunned into silence. They had seen a first-year student, in the middle of her first ever flying lesson, perform a flawless, silent, and incredibly powerful charm that had almost certainly saved another student's life. Madame Hooch reached Neville, her face pale with shock and relief. After confirming he was mostly all right, she turned her sharp gaze upwards to Ariana, who was still hovering serenely in the air. "Miss Dumbledore," she called out, her voice tight with a mixture of awe and sternness. "While I do not condone the use of wands during flying lessons, that was the finest and quickest casting of a cushioning charm I have ever seen. 10 points to Gryffindor for exceptional presence of mind. Now, everyone, on the ground. Class dismissed." As Madame Hooch carted a whimpering Neville off to the hospital wing, the aftermath of the incident began. Malfoy, ever the opportunist, snatched up the remembrall that had fallen from Neville's pocket. Harry, his Gryffindor sense of justice ignited, demanded it back. What followed was the confrontation Ariana remembered from the books: Malfoy taunting Harry, soaring into the air, and throwing the remembrall high towards the castle. Harry, on his broom, performed a spectacular dive and catch, an act that, unbeknownst to him, would lead to his recruitment as the Gryffindor Seeker. Ariana watched it all unfold from the ground, having already landed her broom with a gentle thump. She saw Harry's righteous anger, Malfoy's petty cruelty. To her, it was a predictable, almost tedious display of childish testosterone. She had already solved the immediate problem: Neville's safety. The squabble over a glass bauble was beneath her notice. While the other students were caught up in the drama, she simply returned her broom to the storage shed and began the calm, solitary walk back to the castle. The next few days were a blur of classes and study. Ariana heard the whispers and excited gossip echoing through Gryffindor Tower. Harry had been made Seeker. The youngest house player in a century. He had been caught by McGonagall but rewarded instead of punished. It was the talk of the school. A few days later, the gossip took on a new, more clandestine tone. Malfoy, furious at being upstaged, had challenged Harry to a wizard's duel. Midnight, in the trophy room. Ron, as Harry's self-appointed second, was puffed up with importance. Hermione, ever the voice of reason and rules, was horrified, lecturing them endlessly about the dangers of breaking curfew and the foolishness of rising to Malfoy's bait. The three of them approached Ariana in the common room one evening. She was sitting in her favorite armchair by the fire, a book on advanced potion theory in her lap. Midnight, in her large, panther form, as it was late, curled at her feet, a pool of living shadow in the firelight. The presence of the panther kept most students at a respectful distance. "Ariana, you've got to help us," Hermione began, her voice a stressed whisper. "They're going to do it. They're really going to go and duel Malfoy." Harry and Ron looked at her expectantly. Perhaps they thought she would offer some profound piece of strategy, or talk them out of it, or even offer to join them. Ariana slowly lifted her eyes from her book. Her gaze was not one of concern or judgment. It was one of pure, academic disinterest. She looked at Harry's determined face, Ron's nervous excitement, and Hermione's frantic anxiety. She processed the situation with the cool logic of a strategist assessing a minor, irrelevant skirmish. A midnight duel. A trap, almost certainly. Malfoy would likely tip off Filch. They would get caught. They would lose house points. They would serve detention. The potential outcomes were all mundane, predictable, and ultimately, inconsequential in the grand scheme of things. It was a self-correcting problem. Their actions would have natural, educational consequences. Her intervention was not required. "Why?" she asked, her voice quiet. It was not a question of moral support, but a simple request for data. "Why would you do this? He insulted my family." Ron burst out. "And he's a foul git. We have to stand up to him," Harry added, his voice full of Gryffindor conviction. Ariana considered their reasoning. It was based on emotion, on pride, on a childish code of honor. It was illogical. Malfoy was an irritant, not a genuine threat. Engaging with him on these terms was a waste of time and energy that could be better spent studying. She gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. "No," she said. The single word fell into the space between them with the finality of a closing door. It wasn't "No, you shouldn't go." It was "No, I will not be involved." Hermione looked aghast. "But they'll get in trouble." "Then that will be a lesson for them," Ariana replied, her voice still perfectly calm. "Actions have consequences. It is a fundamental principle." She looked at Harry, a hint of something, perhaps disappointment in his lack of foresight, in her eyes. "A duel is a confrontation. You are choosing to walk into a confrontation of his design, on his terms, at a time and place of his choosing. It is strategically unsound." With that, she lowered her eyes and returned to her book on potion theory. The conversation was over. She had analyzed the data, found the situation to be a frivolous and unnecessary risk, and had logically decided to allocate 0 resources to it. She would not lecture them like Hermione, nor would she aid them like Ron. She would simply not participate. The three of them stood there for a moment, stunned by her cool, absolute refusal to engage. They had expected her to be an ally, a confidant. Instead, she was a neutral observer, a scientist who refused to interfere with the experiment. They left her by the fire and went to continue their hushed, frantic planning, leaving Ariana to the quiet company of her book and her panther, her mind already back on the subtle interactions of powdered moonstone and syrup of hellebore. She had her own battles to fight, and they were waged in the silent, esoteric realms of knowledge, not in dusty trophy rooms at midnight. Chapter 11, The Calculus of Halloween. The morning after the midnight duel was thick with unspoken tension. News travelled through Gryffindor Tower with the speed of a lit fuse. Potter, Weasley, Granger, and Longbottom had lost Gryffindor a staggering 50 points each. 200 points, vanished in a single night. The collective groan of the house was a palpable thing. The 4 of them were pariahs, ostracized at the breakfast table, glared at in the common room. Ariana observed the fallout with the detached air of a sociologist studying group dynamics. It was, as she had predicted, a self-correcting problem with natural consequences. Harry and Ron were sullen and defensive. Neville was terrified. But it was Hermione who reacted most strangely. Her initial "I told you so" attitude quickly curdled into something else, something sharper and more personal. Her frustration and embarrassment at being caught seemed to require an outlet, and since Harry and Ron were her co-conspirators, she turned the full force of her indignation on the one person who had refused to be drawn in. "If you had just come with us, or at least tried to talk them out of it properly, none of this would have happened," she hissed at Ariana as they walked to herbology, her voice a low, furious buzz. "You just sat there. You didn't care at all." "Caring would not have altered the outcome," Ariana replied calmly, not breaking her stride. "Their decision was made. My presence would only have resulted in an additional 50-point deduction for Gryffindor." "That's not the point," Hermione retorted, her face flushed. "The point is loyalty. The point is friendship. We're all in the same house. We're supposed to stick together." Ariana stopped and turned, her periwinkle eyes coolly assessing the overwrought girl. "Loyalty is not synonymous with enabling poor judgment, Hermione. Friendship does not require participation in strategically unsound ventures. They made a choice. They are now experiencing the consequences. That is the nature of learning." The cold, impeccable logic of it seemed to incense Hermione even more. This became her new refrain. For days, she found ways to criticize Ariana. It was no longer about the duel, it was about everything. Ariana's quietness was aloofness. Her perfect spell work was showing off. Her advanced reading was an arrogant refusal to engage with her peers. It was a relentless barrage of petty complaints and pointed remarks, a clear manifestation of Hermione's own insecurity and a budding jealousy towards a girl who seemed to achieve with effortless grace what Hermione had to fight tooth and nail for. Ariana endured it all with the serene indifference of a mountain weathering a summer squall. Hermione's emotional outbursts were data points, symptoms of an intellect that had not yet learned to govern its own anxieties. She was a tangled knot of potential and insecurity, and Ariana had neither the time nor the inclination to untangle her. The tension came to a head on Halloween morning, in Charm's class. The lesson was the levitation charm, Wingardium Leviosa. Professor Flitwick, perched on his customary pile of books, demonstrated the swish and flick wand movement with gusto. The students were paired off to practice on feathers. Wingardium Leviosa, Ron snapped his wand, waving his arms around like a windmill. You're saying it wrong yourself. Hermione retorted, her voice tight with frustration. Her feather was lying stubbornly on the desk. It's Leviosa, not Leviosa. Make the gar nice and long. Beside them, Ariana watched the feather on her own desk. She didn't bother with the swish and flick, a physical mnemonic for those who couldn't grasp the pure intentio. She simply focused her will, visualizing the feather lifting, weightless and compliant, and whispered, Wingardium Leviosa. Her feather rose gracefully into the air. It didn't just float, it danced. With silent applications of her will, she made it perform a slow, elegant pirouette, then trace a perfect figure eight in the air above her desk before bringing it to a gentle, motionless hover. It was another display of silent, effortless mastery. Professor Flitwick clapped his tiny hands in delight. Superb! Another master class in charm work, Miss Dumbledore. Ron, witnessing this, let out a groan of frustration, coupled with Hermione's nagging. No wonder she hasn't got any friends, he muttered to Harry, loud enough for Hermione and Ariana to hear. She's a nightmare, honestly. The words struck Hermione like a physical blow. Her face crumpled. She shoved her books into her bag, and with a choked sob, she ran from the classroom. The rest of the class fell into an awkward silence. Ron looked slightly guilty but mostly defiant. Harry looked uncomfortable. Ariana, however, was already running a different set of calculations. She knew what was coming. She knew from the story that Hermione would spend the rest of the day crying in the girls' lavatory. She knew a troll would be let into the dungeons during the Halloween feast. She knew Quirrell was the culprit. And she knew that Harry and Ron, upon realizing Hermione didn't know about the troll, would go after her, resulting in a confrontation that would cement their friendship. This was a key nexus point in the timeline. The original story required that confrontation. It required Harry and Ron to save Hermione. But Ariana had a different set of priorities. Her first priority was mitigating unnecessary risk to Harry. Sending him, an untrained 11-year-old, to fight a fully grown mountain troll was a fundamentally stupid and dangerous idea, regardless of the outcome in the books. Her second priority was her own developing objective, to test her abilities against a significant, tangible threat in a controlled environment. The troll was a perfect opportunity. It was a problem that required a decisive, powerful solution. She needed to isolate Harry from the situation, and she needed a valid, unassailable reason for her own absence from the feast. The two problems had a single, elegant solution. After Charm's class, as students began chattering excitedly about the feast, Ariana approached Harry. Ron had already stomped off, still muttering about Hermione. Harry, she said, her voice soft, pulling him away from the flow of traffic in the corridor. Oh, hi, Ariana, he said, looking slightly distracted. I was thinking, she began, her expression serene, but her periwinkle eyes holding a rare, gentle warmth that was reserved almost exclusively for him. Today is Halloween. It was, the day your parents died, wasn't it? Harry froze. The excited buzz of the school faded into a distant hum. No one had ever mentioned the anniversary to him before. The Dursleys certainly hadn't. His friends, caught up in the novelty of a magical Halloween, hadn't even thought of it. For the first time, someone was acknowledging the deep, personal sorrow of the day, not just the public legend of the boy who lived. Yes, he said, his voice barely a whisper. A feast and a celebration, it doesn't seem appropriate, Ariana continued gently. I was wondering if perhaps you would prefer to skip it. We could go to the kitchens, get some food there. And then maybe, we could go up to the Olori. And you could tell me about them. What you know of them. The offer was a lifeline. He had been dreading the loud, cheerful feast, the forced jollity that would feel so hollow on a day like this. He had been planning to endure it, to put on a brave face. The thought of spending a quiet evening in remembrance, with the one person who seemed to understand him without needing explanations, was an overwhelming relief. It was an act of profound, intuitive kindness. And it was also, in Ariana's coolly logical mind, a perfectly executed strategic move. Yeah, Harry said, his voice thick with emotion. I'd like that. I'd like that a lot, thank you, Ariana. Of course, she said. We can meet in the entrance hall when everyone else goes into the feast. Chapter 12, A Symphony of Calculated Force. As the great hall filled with the sound of hundreds of chattering students eagerly anticipating the Halloween feast, two small figures slipped away from the throng. Harry, feeling a quiet gratitude that was so profound it was almost painful, followed Ariana. She moved with her usual silent grace, leading him not towards the dungeons or the upper floors, but down a flight of stairs he'd never noticed before, towards the school's bustling heart. The entrance to the kitchens was hidden behind a large, unassuming painting of a bowl of fruit. Ariana tickled the pair, and it giggled, squirming before transforming into a green, shimmering doorknob. The sight brought a small, genuine smile to Harry's face. The kitchens were a stark contrast to the Gothic grandeur of the rest of the castle. It was a cavernous, high-ceilinged room, warm and bright, filled with the delicious smells of roasting pumpkin and baking bread. Dozens of house elves, clad in tea towels stamped with the Hogwarts crest, rushed about, their large, bat-like ears flapping as they tended to pots and pans and carried enormous platters of food up to the great hall. A few of them noticed the two students and immediately scurried over, bowing so low their noses nearly touched the flagstone floor. "Can we help you, young master and miss?" one squeaked, his tennis ball eyes wide with reverence. "We won't be attending the feast," Ariana explained, her voice gentle but clear, addressing the elves with a simple respect that made them stand up a little straighter. "We were hoping we might be able to have a small, quiet meal down here instead." The elves seemed utterly delighted by the request. In moments, they had cleared a small wooden table in a quiet corner and loaded it with a selection of simpler fare roast chicken, potatoes, a small pumpkin pasty each, and 2 goblets of pumpkin juice. It was perfect. They ate in a comfortable silence, the distant roar of the feast above them a muted backdrop. For the first time, Harry felt the oppressive weight of Halloween lift. He wasn't the boy who lived, the symbol of Voldemort's downfall. He was just Harry, sharing a quiet meal with a friend who understood the sorrow beneath the spectacle. After they had eaten, they began to make their way back up through the castle, intending to go to the Olori as planned. Ariana chose a route that took them along the second-floor corridor, a path she had mapped in her mind and knew to be close to the site of the original story's confrontation. It was a necessary detour for her plan to unfold. As they passed a set of girls' lavatories, a sound pierced the relative quiet of the empty corridor. It was a scream. A high, terrified scream of pure, unadulterated panic. It was Hermione. Harry froze, his blood running cold. That was Hermione. What's going on? Before he could even process the thought, a smell hit them, a foul, nauseating stench, like a public toilet that hadn't been cleaned in a year, mixed with something vaguely swampy. And then they heard it. A low, guttural grunt, followed by the sound of splintering wood and shattering porcelain. Ariana didn't need to see it to know what it was. Her plan was now in motion. "Stay behind me, Harry," she said, her voice dropping the gentle warmth it had held in the kitchens and taking on the cool, sharp edge of command. Her elder wand slid from its holster into her hand with a silent flick of her wrist. She moved towards the source of the noise, not with a panicked rush, but with the swift, purposeful stride of a soldier advancing on a known target. She rounded the corner and saw the scene. The lavatory had been destroyed. Sinks were torn from the walls, pipes were broken, and water was flooding the floor. And in the center of the devastation stood a 12-foot mountain troll. Its skin was the color of dull granite, its body was lumpy and brutish, and it was wielding a massive, gnarled club. It had Hermione cornered, pressed back against the far wall, her face white with terror, too petrified to even scream again. The troll raised its club, its tiny, dull eyes fixed on its prey. Ariana acted. Her magic flowed from her, not in a single burst, but in a rapid, precise sequence, a symphony of calculated force. First, protection. "Harry, the door." "Protego," she commanded, not even looking back. A shield of shimmering, transparent energy erupted from her wand, forming a dome over Hermione just as the troll's club came crashing down. The wood impacted the magical barrier with a deafening crack, sending splinters flying but leaving Hermione completely unharmed, albeit shaking uncontrollably. Second, control the battlefield. "Block its path," Ariana murmured to herself. She aimed her wand at the floor in front of the troll. With a silent, powerful weaving motion, the wet flagstones beneath the creature's feet transmuted, their surface becoming a sheet of impossibly smooth, frictionless ice. The troll, attempting to take another step, let out a grunt of surprise as its huge feet shot out from under it. It windmilled its arms, trying to keep its balance, its club swinging wildly. Third, disorient the enemy. While it was off balance, she cast again. "Lumos Maxima," she incanted, but this was no gentle, colored light. She poured a raw, concentrated burst of power into the spell. A sphere of brilliant, blinding white light, as intense as a flashbang, exploded directly in the troll's face. The creature roared in pain and confusion, clapping its huge hands over its eyes, completely blinded. Fourth, disarm. The troll was still flailing, its club a menace even while it was blind. Wingardium Leviosa, Ariana cast, her wand movement sharp and precise. The massive wooden club was wrenched from the troll's grasp and lifted high into the air, hovering 20 feet above the creature's head. The troll, now blind, disarmed, and slipping on the magical ice, was a pathetic, floundering thing. It slipped again, its feet flying up, and it crashed onto its back with a tremendous, ground-shaking thud that made the very walls tremble. Its head hit the stone floor hard, and it lay there, dazed and groaning. Finally, neutralize the threat. With the troll prone and disoriented, Ariana guided the levitating club directly over its face. She then cancelled the charm. The massive weight of the wood, combined with gravity, did the rest. The club fell, not with a swing, but with a straight, brutal drop, impacting the troll's temple with a sickening, wet crunch. The creature's groans ceased. It was out cold. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 15 seconds. Ariana did not relax. "Incarcerus," she stated calmly. Thick, magical ropes erupted from her wand and wrapped themselves tightly around the unconscious troll, binding its limbs securely. The situation was contained. Just as the ropes finished tightening, the sound of running footsteps echoed down the corridor. Professors McGonagall, Snape, and Quirrell burst onto the scene, their faces a mixture of alarm and disbelief. They took in the devastation, the unconscious, bound troll, the terrified but shielded Hermione, the pale-faced Harry by the door, and finally, Ariana, standing calmly in the center of it all, her wand still held in a ready position. "Explain yourselves." McGonagall demanded, her voice shaking with rage and relief. Quirrell, stammering and trembling, looked at the troll. But, it was supposed to be in the dungeons. Snape's black eyes, however, were fixed on Ariana, a flicker of something unreadable shock? Respect? Suspicion, in their depths. Before Hermione could open her mouth to stammer out the lie she had been formulating in her head, the one where she took the blame to save Harry and Ron, Ariana spoke. Her voice was clear, calm, and carried over the sound of gushing water. It was the voice of someone delivering a simple, factual report. Ron Weasley made Hermione cry in charms class this morning, she began, leaving no room for interruption. She has been in this lavatory ever since. Harry and I were not at the feast. Today is the anniversary of his parents' death, and we felt it was more appropriate to grieve quietly than to celebrate. We were on our way back from the kitchens when we heard her scream. I shielded her, and then I neutralized the threat. Her statement was a masterpiece of truth. It was concise, it was accurate, and it preempted any possible narrative Hermione might have invented. It laid the blame for Hermione's presence squarely on Ron's shoulders, it provided an unassailable alibi for herself and Harry, and it presented her own actions not as reckless heroism, but as a logical, necessary response to an immediate danger. The professors were stunned into silence. McGonagall looked from Ariana's serene, composed face to Hermione's tear-streaked one, then to the unconscious troll, and a dawning understanding spread across her features. Snape's lip curled, but he said nothing, his gaze still fixed on the girl who had single-handedly, and with terrifying efficiency, taken down a fully grown mountain troll. Hermione stared at Ariana, her mouth opening and closing silently. She had been ready to lie, to sacrifice her own reputation to protect the boys who had insulted her. And Ariana, with a few simple, true sentences, had rendered it all unnecessary. She had not only saved her life with magic, but she had also protected her with the truth, cutting through the potential tangle of lies and blame with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. In that moment, standing amidst the wreckage, Hermione Granger looked at Ariana Dumbledore and saw not a rival, not an aloof prodigy, but a force of nature unlike anything she had ever encountered. Chapter 13, The Alliance of Minds. The silence in the ruined lavatory was thick and heavy, punctuated only by the drip of water from broken pipes and Quirrell's pathetic, whimpering noises. The three senior professors stared at the scene, processing Ariana's calm, factual report. It was McGonagall who finally broke the spell, her professional demeanor reasserting itself over her shock. "You neutralized the threat," she repeated, her voice a mixture of awe and incredulity. She took a step closer, her sharp eyes taking in the details, the sheet of magical ice, now slowly melting, the massive, bound troll, the shimmering protego still faintly glowing around a trembling Hermione. "Miss Dumbledore, what spells did you use?" It was not an accusation, but a demand for a formal after-action report. Snape leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed, his expression one of intense, predatory curiosity. He, more than anyone, recognized the sheer level of magical proficiency that had been on display. Ariana lowered her wand, the tip still glowing faintly. First, a shield charm, protego, to protect Hermione from the immediate impact. Then, a localized transfiguration on the floor, to create a low-friction surface and disrupt its balance. While it was disoriented, I used a high-intensity wand lighting charm, Lumos Maxima, to temporarily overload its optical senses. Then, a levitation charm, Wingardium Leviosa, to disarm it. Finally, I used the troll's own club, with the assistance of gravity, to render it unconscious, followed by an Incarcerus charm to secure it. She delivered the explanation with the cool, detached clarity of an orator briefing a mission. She didn't boast. She didn't embellish. She simply stated the tactical sequence. Each spell was basic in principle first-year charms, a simple transfiguration, but she had applied them with a level of power, precision, and strategic thinking that was utterly unheard of in a student, let alone an 11-year-old. She hadn't overpowered the troll with a single, mighty curse, she had dismantled its ability to fight, piece by logical piece. Snape's black eyes narrowed. She had not only performed flawlessly but had analyzed and articulated her actions with a chilling degree of competence. This was not the work of a gifted child, it was the work of a master strategist. McGonagall looked utterly flabbergasted. You transfigured the floor into ice. It seemed more efficient than attempting to bind its legs while it was still mobile, Ariana explained simply. The sheer audacity and brilliance of the tactic left McGonagall speechless. She looked at Harry, who was still standing by the door looking stunned, and then at Hermione, who was finally beginning to emerge from her shell shock, her mind, always analytical, starting to process the tactical genius she had just witnessed. 50 points, McGonagall said, her voice filled with a stunned reverence that momentarily overrode her usual sternness. 50 points will be awarded to Gryffindor for the most brilliant and courageous use of magic I have seen in decades. She then seemed to remember herself and turned a stern glare on Quirrell. Professor, perhaps you can explain why a mountain troll was on the second floor when you specifically stated it was in the dungeons. Quirrell stammered incoherently about the troll being clever and knowing its way around, a lie so transparently weak it was insulting. Dumbledore arrived then, his presence filling the corridor, his eyes taking in the scene with a grave expression. He listened to McGonagall's quick summary, his gaze lingering on Ariana with that now familiar mixture of sorrow, pride, and protective resolve. He said little, merely instructing the other teachers to handle the troll and ensuring the students were escorted back to their common room. The journey back to Gryffindor Tower was a silent one. Harry was still trying to process the lightning-fast sequence of events. He had been ready to fight, to do something, but Ariana had handled the entire situation before he could even cast a single spell. He was beginning to realize that being her friend meant occupying a very different role than the one he was used to with Ron, it meant being a spectator to a level of power he couldn't yet comprehend. Hermione walked beside Ariana, her usual stream of chatter conspicuously absent. She kept glancing at the serene, blonde girl, her mind racing. She replayed the encounter again and again. The shield charm, cast without a moment's hesitation. The tactical use of transfiguration. The blinding light. The disarming. The clinical, final strike. And then, the truth. The calm, cutting truth that had protected her not just from the troll, but from her own impending, foolish lie. Ariana had not only been braver and more powerful, but she had been smarter. She had outthought everyone, including Hermione herself. The jealousy that had been festering in Hermione for weeks did not intensify, it simply evaporated. It was impossible to be jealous of something so far beyond her own scale. You don't feel jealous of a thunderstorm or a tidal wave, you feel awe. All her petty criticisms, her sniping remarks, now seemed laughably small, like a child throwing pebbles at a fortress. When they reached the portrait of the fat lady and uttered the password, the common room fell silent. The news of the 200-point loss had made them pariahs. But Ron, who had heard from a prefect what had happened, was waiting for them, his face pale. "Is it true?" he whispered. "You fought a troll?" Before Harry could answer, Ariana simply nodded and started walking towards the girls' dormitory staircase. She had no interest in recounting the events or basking in the new, awestruck stares of her housemates. The problem was solved. The event was over. Hermione, however, stopped in front of her. "Ariana," she said, her voice small and tight. Ariana paused, turning to face her. "Thank you," Hermione whispered, her eyes shining with unshed tears. It was not just a thank you for saving her life. It was a thank you for telling the truth, for showing her a better way. It was an apology and an acknowledgement all rolled into one. Ariana looked at the girl, the brilliant, insecure, lonely girl, and saw not the annoying know-it-all from class, but the raw potential beneath. She saw a mind that, if honed and directed, could be a formidable asset. She saw a flicker of the loyal friend she knew Hermione would become. And for the first time, she felt a genuine, uncalculated flicker of empathy. In a gesture that stunned Harry, Ron, and everyone else watching, Ariana closed the small distance between them and wrapped her arms around Hermione in a brief, gentle hug. It was not a warm, effusive embrace, but it was solid, reassuring, and deeply sincere. "You are safe now, Hermione," she said softly, her voice for Hermione's ears alone. "That is what matters." She then released her and continued up the stairs, leaving a stunned and tearful Hermione in her wake. That single, quiet gesture was a peace treaty, an alliance, and a coronation all in one. The feud, one-sided as it had been, was over. From that night on, everything changed. Hermione no longer saw Ariana as a rival. She saw her as a mentor, a puzzle, and an ally. Her brilliant, fact-finding mind now had a new subject of intense study, the quiet, enigmatic girl who wove magic like music. She began to ask Ariana questions not about gossip or schoolwork, but about theory. "When you transfigured the floor," she'd ask in a hushed tone in the library, "were you focusing on the molecular state of the water or the crystalline structure of the ice?" Ariana, in turn, found a mind that could almost keep up with her own. She would answer Hermione's questions with clear, concise explanations drawn from the advanced texts she read, giving the other girl a glimpse into a world of magic far beyond their first-year curriculum. The rest of the school soon began to notice the shift. The two smartest first-year witches were no longer at odds. They were a unit. They would be seen in the library, heads bent together over ancient tomes. They would walk to class together, engaged in quiet, intense conversation that no one else could follow. The sight of them together became a symbol of intellectual power that was, in its own way, far more intimidating than any physical threat. The school's bullies learned quickly to give them a wide berth. The professors watched with fascination. Snape's sneers became slightly less pronounced when he saw them together, and Dumbledore's eyes held a deep, thoughtful light. The boys, Harry and Ron, were left slightly adrift. They were still friends with Hermione, but she was now part of a duumvirate, an alliance of minds that they couldn't fully penetrate. They were the brawn, or in Harry's case, the chosen one, but Ariana and Hermione were rapidly becoming the undisputed brains of the operation. A new, powerful, and utterly terrifying friendship had been forged in the wreckage of a lavatory, and Hogwarts would never be quite the same. Chapter 14, The Architecture of Memory. The weeks leading up to Christmas saw Hogwarts transform. A blanket of thick, pristine snow covered the grounds, muffling the world in a peaceful silence. Suits of armor were enchanted to sing slightly off-key carols, and great wreaths of holly and mistletoe appeared in the corridors. The impending holiday created a schism in the student body. The majority were giddy with the prospect of returning home, while a quiet minority prepared to stay. This year, the number of Gryffindor first years staying behind was unusually high. Harry, having no home to go to, was an obvious resident. The Weasley parents, it was announced, were traveling to Romania to spend the holiday with their second eldest son, Charlie, who worked with dragons. This left Ron, for the first time in his life, spending Christmas at Hogwarts, a prospect he greeted with a mixture of disappointment and a secret, thrilling sense of independence. Hermione, whose parents were dentists and avid skiers, had decided to stay to take advantage of the quiet libraries for a light revision, a decision that surprised no one. Neville's grandmother was taking a rare trip abroad, leaving him in the care of the castle. And Ariana, for whom the orphanage was no longer a home but merely a place she had once stayed, had never considered leaving. Hogwarts was her reality now, her laboratory and her sanctuary. The dynamic of their small, burgeoning group solidified in the quiet castle. With the majority of the student body gone, the five of them became a self-contained unit, an odd little surrogate family. They claimed the prime armchairs by the common room fire, playing explosive Snap, a game Ron had to teach Ariana the complex, illogical rules of an wizard's chess, at which Ariana proved to be a terrifyingly prescient player, her quiet, strategic mind seeing threats 10 moves in advance. Hermione and Ariana's intellectual alliance deepened. They would spend long afternoons in the library, Hermione devouring facts and histories while Ariana deconstructed the fundamental theories that underpinned them. Ariana, in turn, began to quietly guide Hermione, pushing her beyond rote memorization towards a true understanding of magical principles. "Don't just learn the counter curse, Hermione," she would say softly, "understand why it works. What is the magical axiom it's exploiting in the original curse?" It was a paradigm shift for Hermione, one that was both challenging and exhilarating. Throughout this time, Ariana was engaged in a quiet, methodical project of her own. Her gifts were not last-minute purchases. They were carefully considered, meticulously planned operations. She spent an afternoon with a tearfully grateful Hagrid, who happily shared a handful of blurry, joyous photographs of James and Lily. She made formal appointments with Professors McGonagall and Flitwick, who, after some initial surprise, delved into old school archives to produce photos of 2 of their most brilliant former students. She sent a carefully worded letter to Augusta Longbottom via the school owls, beginning with her sincere gratitude for Neville's well-being and gently broaching the subject of his mother's connection to the Potters. The formidable old witch, already impressed by the girl who had saved her grandson, sent back a small packet of photos with a curt but approving note. Her most difficult acquisition came from the dungeons. She approached Professor Snape after a potions class, waiting until every other student had fled his intimidating presence. She did not ask for a photo of his old classmate. She approached it with cool, unassailable logic. "Professor," she had said, her voice calm in the frigid air of the dungeon classroom, "I am compiling a historical record of